Get away from me!" Ethan Caldwell's voice tore through the rain like a blade, his hand locked hard around Clara Whitfield's wrist as she pressed a cloth against the blood soaking through his shirt. "You don't know what they call me in that town. You don't know what I did." Lightning cracked over the ridge, throwing his scarred face into full light for the first time she had ever seen it clearly. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. "I don't care what they call you," she said, gripping his hand back just as hard. "Tell me what happened to your face. Before we continue, if you believe love can survive even the deepest wounds a person carries, subscribe to this channel now and tell us in the comments which city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that storm, to that ridge above Silver Creek, Montana territory. 1884, where everything for Ethan Caldwell and Clara Whitfield was about to change forever. The rain had not stopped for 3 hours, and Clara Whitfield's hands had gone numb from holding the reins. She hadn't meant to be out this late. She hadn't meant to take the shortcut through the ridge trail either, but the boarding house in Silver Creek closed its doors at dark, and Mrs. Halloran had made it clear more than once that a schoolteacher arriving after supper was a schoolteacher who didn't understand her place yet. Clara understood her place well enough. She simply hadn't cared to argue. The wind was the thing that scared the horse first. It came sideways off the mountains, carrying the smell of wet pine, and something else, something like smoke, that had no business being there in a storm like this. The mare reared, and Clara had exactly 1 second to grip the saddle horn before the animal bolted off the trail, entirely crashing through brush that tore at Clara's skirt and scraped along her arms. "Whoa, whoa, girl, easy!" The horse didn't listen. Horses rarely did in Clara's experience when they'd decided the world was ending. It was the flash of lightning that saved her in the end, though it didn't feel like saving in the moment. The mare saw something in the light, a shape on the ground, low and dark and unmoving, and threw Clara clean off her back before rearing again and vanishing into the trees. Clara hit the ground hard enough to knock the air from her lungs. For a moment, she simply lay there in the mud, blinking up at a black sky, waiting for her body to remember how to breathe. Then she heard the sound. A groan. Low-pained human. She sat up fast, ignoring the ache blooming across her ribs, and crawled toward the shape her horse had bolted from. Lightning split the sky again, and this time she saw him clearly, a man on his back beside a fallen horse, one hand pressed to his side, dark liquid spreading between his fingers that the rain couldn't wash away fast enough to hide what it was. Oh no, sir, can you hear me?" His eyes opened. Even in the dark, even in the rain, she could see the left side of his face was different from the right, old scarring, pale and rope-like, running from his temple down past his jaw. He looked at her the way a wounded animal looks at anything that comes near it, not with relief, with calculation. "Go," he said. His voice was wrecked barely more than breath. "Get away from here. You're bleeding badly. I said go." He tried to push himself up on one elbow and failed, collapsing back with a sound that was half curse, half sob of frustration. "You don't want to be found out here with me. Trust me on that, if nothing else." Clara didn't move. She'd never been especially good at doing what she was told, a fact her late father had complained about, right up until the year he died, and a fact that had gotten her exiled from Boston in the first place. She looked at the wound instead, at the way his shirt had gone black and heavy with blood along his left side. "That's a bullet wound," she said quietly. It wasn't a question. Something shifted behind his eyes. "You know gunshot wounds. I know enough to know you'll bleed to death in this mud if somebody doesn't stop it." She was already tearing a strip from her petticoat hands, shaking from cold and fear. Both, though, she'd have died before admitting to the fear. "Hold still. I told you to go." "You did. I heard you." She pressed the cloth hard against the wound, and he made a sound through his teeth that told her exactly how much that hurt. "I'm choosing not to listen. Now hold still, or I'll press harder." For a long moment, he only stared at her, this stranger soaked to the bone kneeling over him in the mud, with no earthly reason to be helping a man she'd never laid eyes on. Then, unbelievably, something like a laugh escaped him, thin and pained. You don't know who I am. Right now, you're a man who's about to bleed out if I don't get you off this ridge. That's who you are to me." She looked up, scanning the dark tree line, half expecting to see whoever had put a bullet in him step out of the shadows. "Can you stand? I have a wagon down near the creek crossing if my horse hasn't run clear to Wyoming by now. You should be more afraid of me than of whoever did this. I'll take my chances." She got an arm under his shoulders, feeling the solid weight of him, the way his whole body was shaking now, from blood loss and cold. "What's your name?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might refuse to answer that too. Then, Ethan. Ethan Caldwell. Something in his voice when he said it, like he was bracing for her reaction, like the name itself was a confession. It meant nothing to Clara. She'd only been in Montana territory 11 days. "Well, Ethan Caldwell," she said, hauling him upright with more strength than her frame suggested she had. "You're about to find out I'm more stubborn than whoever shot you." Getting him down the ridge took the better part of an hour. Most of it spent with his arm slung over her shoulders, and both of them soaked through and cursing the mud in their own ways, his low and sharp hers muttered under her breath in a manner her mother would have found deeply unladylike. By some mercy, her mare hadn't run all the way to Wyoming after all. Clara found her trembling near the creek crossing, and between the two of them, woman and wounded stranger, they managed to get Ethan into the wagon bed. "Where's your place?" she asked, climbing up onto the seat, rain still hammering the canvas overhead. "How far?" "No." His voice had gone hard again, some strength returning to it, now that the immediate danger of the ridge was behind them. "Take me to the doctor in town. Drop me at the edge, and I'll walk the rest. You can barely sit up. I mean it. Don't take me to my ranch, and don't you dare take me into the middle of Silver Creek with my face lit up for every window on Main Street to see." A muscle worked in his jaw. "You don't understand what happens if they see me hurt like this. They'll say I finally got what was coming to me." Clara twisted around on the seat to look at him properly. Even in the dark, even bleeding, there was something in the way he held himself like a man, used to absorbing blows physical and otherwise, and simply enduring them alone. Who would say that? Everyone. He said it flatly like a fact as plain as the weather. Every soul in that town. That can't be true. "You've been here what, a week? 2. A ghost of dark humor touched his voice despite the pain. "Give it time. You'll hear plenty about me. None of it kind, and most of it not even accurate, but plenty." Clara considered this for a moment, the rain running down the back of her collar, her horse stamping impatiently in the traces. Then she turned back around and snapped the reins. "I'm taking you to your ranch," she said. "Point me the direction." "I told you. You told me not to take you to town, and I'm not going to. I never said I'd leave you on the roadside either, so you can save your breath arguing with me." "Which way?" Silence, but for the rain. Then grudgingly from behind her, North Fork. Past the split oak. She turned the wagon north. Caldwell Ranch. When they finally reached it, was smaller than Clara expected. A modest house, a barn in decent repair, fences that had clearly been mended by careful hands more than once. There was no wife's touch to the place, no curtains in the windows, no garden save for one small overgrown plot near the porch that looked like it had been someone's pride once and nobody's business in a long while since. She got him inside, got him onto the bed in the single bedroom, and set about the grim business of cleaning and dressing a bullet wound by lamplight while he gritted his teeth and refused 3 separate times to cry out. "You don't have to be brave in front of me," she said at one point, working the cloth against the wound with hands that had gone steadier now that there was work to focus on. "I won't think less of you for making noise. I'm not being brave." His voice was tight breath coming shallow. "I just don't make noise anymore. Stopped being worth the trouble." "That's a strange thing to say." "Is it?" Not a question. His eyes were closed, sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cold rain still lashing the window. "You'll understand once you've been in Silver Creek a little longer, Miss Whitfield. Clara Whitfield. Miss Whitfield." He opened his eyes and looked at her. Really looked in a way that made her fingers still against his side. You should leave in the morning and forget you ever found me on that ridge. I mean that as a kindness, not a threat. I don't frighten easily. That's because you don't know me yet." She finished tying off the bandage and sat back on her heels, studying him in the lamplight, the scarring on his face that ran deep enough to have clearly cost him more than skin. The exhaustion carved into features that might otherwise have been handsome. The wariness that seemed etched into him as permanently as the scars themselves. "Who shot you tonight, Mr. Caldwell?" Something flickered across his face. Fear maybe, or fury, or grief, so old it had calcified into something else entirely. "Doesn't matter. It matters to me. I was on that ridge too." "Then it should matter to you that you get as far from me as possible come sunrise." His eyes drifted shut again, the pain and blood loss finally dragging him under. "Trouble follows me, Miss Whitfield. Always has. I'd rather it not follow you too." His breathing evened into unconsciousness before she could argue further. Clara sat beside the bed for a long moment, listening to the rain against the roof, looking at the stranger she'd hauled off a mountainside for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself. Then quietly, in the fever-thin voice of a man no longer fully present, he began to speak. "Told them to run. I told them. The fire was already at the barn. I told them to run." Clara went very still. "Pa said hold the line, and I held it, and it still wasn't enough." His hand twitched against the quilt, reaching for something that wasn't there. "Should have been me. Should have been me instead of—" He trailed into silence, his face twisting once more before smoothing into the blankness of deep sleep. Clara sat there a long time afterward, staring at the scarred side of his face, understanding suddenly that whatever had happened to Ethan Caldwell, it had cost him far more than the skin it had taken. He woke before dawn, and the first thing he did was reach for a gun that wasn't at his hip, and the second thing he did was see Clara asleep in the chair beside the bed and go rigid with alarm. "You stayed." Clara blinked awake at the sound of his voice, straightening in the chair, with a wince at the stiffness in her neck. "You needed watching. Fevers can turn on a man in the night." "I told you to leave. You told me a lot of things last night, Mr. Caldwell, most of them while unconscious and talking about a fire." She kept her voice light deliberately, so watching his face for the reaction. It came instantly, his whole body going tense, jaw tight. Eyes suddenly wary in a way that had nothing to do with pain from the wound. "What did I say? Not much that made sense. You said you told someone to run. You said it wasn't enough." She paused. "You said it should have been you instead of someone. You didn't finish that thought." "Good." His voice had gone flat and hard, a door slamming somewhere behind his eyes. "It's not a thought that needs finishing, and it's not your business." "I only meant—" "I know what you meant." He struggled to sit up, wincing hard at the pull of the stitches in his side, waving off her attempt to help him. "You meant well. People who mean well are usually the most dangerous kind in my experience because they don't know when to stop digging." He got himself upright through sheer stubbornness, breathing hard from the effort. "You should go home, Miss Whitfield. I'm grateful for what you did on that ridge. I mean that. But I don't need a nursemaid, and I certainly don't need someone poking around in things that happened a long time before you ever set foot in this territory." Clara stood slowly smoothing her ruined skirt, studying him with an expression that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite hurt either. Something steadier than both. "You know," she said, "in 11 days in Silver Creek, I have met exactly 4 people who spoke to me like I was a person worth knowing, and you're the 5th even flat on your back with a bullet hole in your side and doing your level best to run me off." A small humorless smile touched her mouth. "I've been run off by better men than you, Mr. Caldwell. I don't scare easy, and I definitely don't leave easy." He stared at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. "You don't know what you're inviting staying near me." "Then tell me." "No. Then I suppose I'll just have to find out for myself." She reached for the basin of water on the nightstand businesslike, again checking his bandages with the brisk efficiency of someone who had decided the conversation was for now finished. You lost a great deal of blood. You are not walking anywhere today no matter what you've decided about my leaving. I'll fix something to eat, and then you're going to tell me who shot you, because whoever it was may come looking to finish the job, and I intend to know what I'm watching for. He opened his mouth to argue, surely, given the look on his face, and then closed it again. Some fight going out of him in the face of her stubbornness. For the first time, something almost like reluctant respect crossed his features. You're either very brave or very foolish, Miss Whitfield. My father used to say the same thing. She headed for the door, pausing at the threshold to look back at him. He was usually right about the foolish part. We'll see about the brave.
Jessica.
By the time the sun was fully up, Clara had found the kitchen sparse, but serviceable, had coaxed a fire going in the stove, and had put together a breakfast of eggs and biscuits, from what she could find, all the while turning over in her mind the fragments of what she'd learned in one long, strange night. A fire. A barn. Someone he'd told to run. A wound that should have been someone else's instead of his. She carried a plate back to the bedroom to find Ethan sitting up against the headboard, looking paler than he had any right to be with breakfast in his future, staring out the window at his own land like a man taking inventory of something he was afraid of losing. You should eat, she said, setting the plate on the nightstand. I heard a wagon on the road a moment ago. Clara's stomach dropped. Whoever shot you? No. He didn't look reassured by his own answer. Worse in some ways. That's Sheriff Dale Ashford's rig, unless I've lost track of every sound this ranch makes, which I haven't. He looked at her, something like an apology in his expression, for the first time since she'd met him. You should let me do the talking. The knock came a moment later, hard official 3 raps that had no patience in them. Clara opened the door to find a heavy-set man in a tin star and a mustache that had clearly been groomed with more care than the rest of him, standing on the porch with his hat still on and his eyes already narrowing at the sight of her. Didn't expect to find a lady out here. Sheriff Ashford's gaze moved past her toward the bedroom door, and whatever he saw through the gap made his jaw tighten. Caldwell, you're looking worse than usual even for you. Morning, Sheriff. Ethan's voice from the other room was carefully neutral. What brings you out this far? Report of gunfire up on the Ridge Trail last night. Figured I'd ride out and see if you knew anything about it, seeing as you're about the only soul fool enough to be out in that storm. Ashford stepped past Clara without invitation, filling the small house with an authority that seemed to expect no resistance. And here I find you shot up and a strange woman tending you. Care to explain, or should I start guessing? I was ambushed on the Ridge Trail, Ethan said flatly. Someone put a bullet in me from the tree line. I never saw who. Ambushed. Ashford's tone made clear exactly how much weight he gave that word. Or maybe you got into something you shouldn't have, same as always, and it finally caught up with you. I didn't get into anything, Dale. I was riding home. From where? A pause, just a fraction too long. Doesn't matter. It matters to me, seeing as there's a bullet involved. Ashford's eyes flicked to Clara again, taking her in with an assessment she didn't much care for. And who might you be, miss, riding around wounded outlaws in the middle of a storm? I'm not an outlaw, Ethan said sharp now. I'm Clara Whitfield. She kept her chin level, refusing to be cowed by the sheriff's tone. I'm the new schoolteacher in Silver Creek. I found Mr. Caldwell on the trail last night, injured and bleeding, and I brought him home and tended his wound. That's the whole of it. The new schoolteacher. Ashford said it like the words themselves were a warning, and something in his expression softened, though not kindly, more like pity for a woman who didn't yet know better. Miss Whitfield, I'd advise you to be careful whose wagon you're riding in out here. Folks in Silver Creek have long memories, and Ethan Caldwell isn't a name that sits easy with most of them. So I've been told. Clara's voice was even, but there was steel underneath it. No one's yet told me why. Ashford glanced toward the bedroom, and for a moment, something almost like discomfort crossed his weathered face, the look of a man who knew more than he was willing to say. That's not really my story to tell, miss. You'll hear it soon enough, I expect, one way or another. He settled his hat lower and turned for the door. Caldwell, I'll ask around about who might have been shooting up on that ridge. Wouldn't be the first time somebody had a grudge against you worth acting on. Comforting, Ethan muttered. Wasn't meant to comfort you, meant to warn you. Ashford paused at the threshold, looking back at Clara one more time with something that might have been genuine concern beneath the gruffness. You take care out here, Miss Whitfield. This ranch has seen more trouble than most in this territory, and trouble's got a way of following certain men wherever they go. He left without waiting for a response, his rig creaking away down the muddy road, leaving a silence behind him that Clara could have cut with a knife. She turned back toward the bedroom to find Ethan staring at the far wall, his jaw tight, his hands fisted in the quilt. He's right, you know, Ethan said quietly, not looking at her. About the trouble following me. You should have let him take you back to town just now. Instead, you stood there and told him your name, tied yourself to me in front of the one man in this territory whose opinion actually carries weight. I told him the truth. That's not the same as tying myself to anything. It's exactly the same out here. He finally looked at her, and there was something almost desperate in his expression, some fear that had nothing to do with the wound in his side. You don't understand what you're risking being seen with me. I've watched this town turn on people for less than what you just did. Then perhaps, Clara said, picking up the breakfast plate and pressing it firmly into his hands. It's time this town learned it can't frighten me the way it's apparently frightened everyone else. She stayed 3 more days at Caldwell Ranch through the worst of his fever and the slow grudging mending of his wound, and in those 3 days she learned him the way a person learns a wary animal, not through direct questions, which he deflected with the ease of long practice, but through small observations that added up to something larger. She learned that he woke before dawn every day out of habit, not necessity, and spent the first hour of daylight checking every fence line on the property with an obsessiveness that spoke less of diligence than of fear. She learned that he flinched just slightly every time she moved too quickly near his scarred side, as though some old instinct expected a blow. She learned that he was gentle with the animals in a way he was not gentle with himself, that he'd nursed a lame dog back to health that now followed him everywhere, that he left grain out for a family of foxes, denning near the creek instead of running them off like any other rancher would, that his hands rough and scarred as they were moved with startling tenderness around anything smaller and more helpless than himself. And she learned on the 3rd evening, sitting across from him at the small kitchen table over a supper of stew she'd made from his meager stores, that he had not always been a man who lived alone. You had a family here, she said. It wasn't quite a question. Before. His spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. For a long moment, she thought he would simply refuse to answer the way he'd refused every question that came near the subject of his scars, his past, the fire he'd murmured about in his fever. But something in 3 days of her steady, patient presence must have worn a groove in his defenses, because instead he set the spoon down and said quietly, "My mother, my father, a younger sister, Mary Ellen. She was 12. His jaw worked. There was a land dispute 6 years back. A man named it doesn't matter what his name was. He wanted this valley, wanted the water rights that come with it, and my father wouldn't sell no matter how many times he was asked, and eventually the asking turned into something else. His eyes had gone somewhere far away, somewhere Clara couldn't follow, even if she wanted to. Men came at night. Set the barn alight first to draw us out. My father went for his rifle. I went for Mary Ellen's window, because her room was closest to where the fire caught fastest. Clara sat very still, hardly daring to breathe, afraid that any movement would break whatever fragile thread had gotten him talking at all. I got her out. Ethan continued, voice rough now, but the roof came down on the porch just as we cleared it, and a beam caught me across the face and shoulder. I don't remember much after that pain, mostly, and smoke, and my mother screaming. He touched the scarred side of his face without seeming to notice he was doing it. By the time I could see straight again, my father was dead, shot trying to defend the house. My mother didn't survive the winter after grief took what the fire didn't. I think, though, the doctor called it her heart giving out. Mary Ellen lived. She's in Helena now, married to a good man, and she writes to me sometimes, though I don't answer as often as I should." "And you stayed here?" Clara said softly. "On this land, alone. Somebody had to." His voice had hardened again, some old anger surfacing. "And besides, where was I supposed to go looking like this? Every soul in Silver Creek remembers. That fire remembers whispering that maybe the Caldwells had done something to deserve it. That maybe I'd started it myself, trying to collect on my father's debts. That maybe—" He stopped himself, breathing hard, and when he continued, his voice had gone low and bitter. "It doesn't matter what they say. It never stops, no matter how many years pass. So I stopped giving them the chance to say it to my face. I stopped going into town more than I had to. I let the scars do the talking, since apparently that's all anyone ever wanted to see anyway." Clara reached across the small table, slowly giving him every chance to pull away, and rested her hand over his. "I don't see a monster when I look at you, Ethan Caldwell," she said. "I see a boy who ran into a burning house to save his sister, and a man who spent 6 years punishing himself for surviving it." He looked down at her hand on his, and for the first time since she'd found him bleeding on that ridge, something in his face cracked open, not into words, not yet, but into an expression so raw and unguarded that Clara had to look away for a moment, unable to bear the weight of it. "You shouldn't be kind to me," he said, finally hoarse. "It'll only make it harder when you leave." "Who says I'm leaving? Everyone leaves Silver Creek eventually, Miss Whitfield. Or they leave me specifically once they've heard enough." He pulled his hand back gently, and the walls she'd watched him lower for one brief moment began sliding shut again. "Better you hear that from me now than learn it the hard way later." Butcher. She left the ranch the following morning, not because he'd finally succeeded in driving her away, but because the school session was set to begin, and Mrs. Halloran had already sent word twice demanding to know where the new schoolteacher had gotten to. Ethan walked her to the wagon, moving stiffly but steadily now, the fever long broken and the wound healing clean under her care. "Thank you," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. Like gratitude was a muscle he hadn't exercised in years. For the ridge, for staying, for not running when Ashford came to the door, and could have told you a dozen reasons to. "You don't owe me thanks for treating you like a person, Mr. Caldwell." She climbed up onto the wagon seat, gathering the reins, looking down at him. Standing there in the morning light, with his scarred face turned fully toward her, for once, not hidden or angled away. "I intend to come back and check that wound isn't festering, whether you like it or not." Something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile touched his mouth. "I had a feeling you might say that. You're learning, slowly." He stepped back from the wagon, and for a moment, neither of them moved, some current passing between them that neither seemed quite ready to name. Then he said quieter, "Be careful in town, Clara. Whitmore's been sniffing around the valley again. I saw his surveyors out past the north fence just last week before all this happened. If he hears you've been out here tending to me, he may take an interest in you he otherwise wouldn't have." Whitmore. Charles Whitmore. Land agent businessman, owns half of what he doesn't yet own outright in this territory, and wants the other half besides. Ethan's expression darkened. "He's the reason my father got the offers he refused all those years back. I've never been able to prove it connects to the fire, and God knows I've tried, but I've never once trusted the man, and I'd rather you didn't cross his path if it can be helped." Clara filed the name away carefully. "I'll be careful. See that you are." He hesitated, then added, almost too quiet to hear over the horse's impatient stamping. "And Clara, thank you for asking about my face, instead of just staring at it the way most people do." She held his gaze a moment longer than was strictly proper, something warm and unfamiliar settling in her chest, despite everything. Despite the danger he'd warned her about, despite the sheriff's wary looks, despite a town full of whispers waiting to greet her the moment she rode back through its gates. "It was never your face I was asking about, Ethan," she said. "It was you. It was—" She snapped the reins and rode toward Silver Creek, not yet knowing that the name Charles Whitmore would come to matter more than she could possibly have imagined by nightfall, nor that the men who had put a bullet in Ethan Caldwell on that storm-lashed ridge had not finished what they'd started, and were even now watching the road that led back into town, waiting to see exactly who the schoolteacher would tell about the wound she'd spent 3 days tending in secret. The town noticed everything, and it noticed nothing faster than a woman climbing down from a wagon that wasn't her own 3 days late for supper. Clara felt the eyes on her the moment she turned onto Main Street, a curtain twitching in the mercantile window, 2 women pausing mid-conversation outside the church to watch her pass a boy on the boardwalk who stopped chewing his candy stick just to stare. By the time she pulled up outside the boarding house, her spine had gone rigid with the effort of pretending she didn't notice any of it. Mrs. Halloran was waiting on the porch before Clara had even set the brake. 3 days. The woman's arms were crossed so tight over her apron that her knuckles had gone white. 3 days, Miss Whitfield, and not so much as a note sent back with anyone passing on the road. I had half a mind to send for the sheriff myself. I'm sorry for the worry, Mrs. Halloran. There was an accident on the Ridge Trail. I heard about your accident. The word came out sharp enough to draw blood. Heard it from 3 different mouths before noon yesterday, and every single one of them mentioned exactly whose ranch you were seen riding away from this morning. Clara's stomach tightened, but she kept her chin level. Then you already know I was helping an injured man. I'd think that would earn a measure of understanding, not an interrogation on the porch in front of half the street. An injured man. Mrs. Halloran's eyes flicked past her, scanning the road, as though Ethan himself might materialize out of the dust to confirm the scandal. Ethan Caldwell, Miss Whitfield. Do you have any notion at all what that name means in this town? I'm beginning to gather it means something terrible, though nobody's yet managed to tell me what. It means trouble. It means a man that decent folk keep their distance from for reasons that go back further than you've been breathing air in this territory. Mrs. Halloran lowered her voice, glancing again toward the street, and something in her tone shifted from anger into something closer to genuine if clumsy concern. You're new here. You don't know how quick a reputation can attach itself to a person who isn't careful, and once it does, there's no scrubbing it off. The school board meets Thursday to review your appointment. I'd think hard about what gets said between now and then if I were you. The threat landed exactly as intended, cold and precise, and Clara felt it settle into her stomach like a stone. She had crossed half a continent to take this position, had left Boston with nothing but 2 trunks and a letter of reference, and a desperate need to be somewhere nobody knew her family's disgrace. She could not afford to lose it over a man she'd known 4 days. And yet, I only did what any Christian soul would do for a wounded man on a mountain road, she said carefully. I fail to see how that reflects poorly on my character. It's not your character in question, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Halloran's voice dropped lower still. It's his. By the time Clara reached the schoolhouse the following morning, the whispers had grown legs of their own. She heard fragments as she walked a woman outside the dry goods store, murmuring to her companion out at Caldwell's place for 3 whole days, if you can believe it, and felt her face heat with an anger she had no acceptable way to express. Nobody had asked her a single direct question. They simply talked around her, passed her about her as though she were a story unfolding for their entertainment rather than a woman standing directly in front of them. Inside the schoolhouse, 17 children waited for her, ranging from 6 years old to 13, and Clara forced herself to set the town's judgment aside and focus on the small, expectant faces looking up at her. All but one. A boy near the back, 9 or 10, with a thin, watchful face, sat with his arms crossed, refusing to meet her eyes. When she called the roll and reached his name, Samuel Hargrove, he answered so quietly she nearly missed it. At the midday break, while the other children scattered outside, Samuel lingered near his desk, and Clara approached carefully. You seem troubled today, Samuel. He didn't look up. My pa says I ain't supposed to be too friendly with you. Clara kept her voice even, though something cold moved through her chest. And why is that? 'Cause you been out to the Caldwell place. His voice was young, but his eyes, when he finally lifted them, held something older. Fear, she realized. Real fear. Pa says Whitmore's men come around asking who's friendly with Caldwell and who ain't, and Pa don't want no trouble on account of us needing the loan Mr. Whitmore's bank is thinking about giving us for the new well." Clara went very still. Mr. Whitmore's men are asking about that. About who speaks to Ethan Caldwell. Samuel nodded, small and miserable, clearly aware he'd already said more than he should. "Please don't tell Pa I said nothing." "I won't." Clara crouched down to his level, keeping her voice gentle despite the alarm ringing through her. "Thank you for telling me, Samuel. That took courage." He gave her a small, uncertain smile before darting outside to join the others, and Clara remained crouched by his empty desk a moment longer, turning over what she'd just learned. Whitmore was watching. Whitmore was already asking questions, and it had been less than 2 days. She didn't have to wait long to meet the man himself. He came into the Mercantile that same afternoon while she was purchasing chalk and a length of ribbon for the schoolroom. And she knew him before anyone spoke his name. Knew him by the way the shopkeeper's posture changed the instant the bell over the door rang, by the way every other customer in the store seemed to shrink half a step toward the walls. Charles Whitmore was not a large man, but he filled a room the way large men rarely managed an economy of movement, a stillness that suggested a predator who had never once needed to hurry. "You'll be the new school teacher." His voice was smooth, cultured in a way that stood out sharply against the rough-hewn town around him. "Miss Whitfield, is it I make it my business to know everyone of consequence in Silver Creek? Mr. Whitmore, I presume." Clara kept her tone pleasant, betraying none of the unease crawling up her spine. "Word travels quickly here." "It does, especially concerning young women who spend 3 unaccompanied days at Ethan Caldwell's ranch." His smile didn't waver, but something colder moved behind his eyes. "I trust he was a gentleman. He was injured. I tended his wound and returned to town once he'd recovered enough to manage on his own. I fail to see what business it is of yours or anyone else's." "No business at all, ordinarily." Whitmore stepped closer, lowering his voice to something almost confidential, almost kind, and all the more unsettling for it. "But I have a great deal of history with that family, Miss Whitfield, and a great deal of concern for anyone who finds themselves drawn into Ethan Caldwell's orbit. He is, I'm afraid, a deeply troubled man. The fire that took his parents left more than scars on his face, if you understand my meaning. I understand you're implying something you're unwilling to say outright." Something flickered across his composed features, surprise perhaps at being challenged so directly. Then the smile returned thinner now. "You're sharper than the last schoolteacher this town had. I admire that truly, which is precisely why I'd hate to see you make a costly error in judgment so early in your position here." He reached past her to examine a bolt of fabric on the counter with studied casualness. "The school board answers to the town council, and the town council listens closely to those of us who contribute most generously to this community's welfare. I would hate for anything to jeopardize your appointment, Miss Whitfield. Truly, I would." The threat was so smoothly delivered that for a moment Clara almost missed it entirely. Then the full weight of it settled over her, and her hands went cold around the chalk box she was holding. "Are you threatening my employment, Mr. Whitmore?" "Heavens, no." He looked genuinely wounded by the suggestion, though his eyes told a different story entirely. "I'm simply offering the kind of friendly guidance any respectable member of this community would offer a newcomer. Silver Creek is a small town, Miss Whitfield. Alliances matter here. I'd think carefully about which ones you choose to form." He tipped his hat, already turning for the door. "A pleasure making your acquaintance. I do hope we'll see a great deal more of each other." The bell rang again as he left, and Clara stood frozen at the counter for a long moment, her heart hammering. "You want to be careful with that one," the shopkeeper murmured once the door had shut, glancing nervously toward the window. "Half this town owes him money one way or another. Loans, mortgages, notes on land. Men like that don't make idle talk, Miss Whitfield. Whatever he just told you, I'd take it to heart." She rode out to Caldwell Ranch 2 days later, ostensibly to check the wound as she'd promised. though the real reason sat heavier in her chest with every mile, the growing certainty that something far larger than a single act of charity had already begun closing in around her. She found Ethan at the fence line nearest the north pasture, and even from a distance, she could see something was wrong. He was crouched low, examining a section of wire that had been cut clean through his jaw, set in a hard, furious line. "Ethan!" He looked up, and whatever relief crossed his face at seeing her was quickly swallowed by something darker. "You shouldn't have ridden out here alone." "What happened?" "Someone cut my fences last night. Ran off 11 head of cattle before I even heard the commotion." He straightened, wiping his hands on his trousers, and for the first time, she noticed the exhaustion carved into his face, the sleeplessness of a man who'd spent the night chasing shadows across his own land. "Found tracks heading toward the Whitmore property line before I lost them in the rocks." Clara's stomach dropped. "Whitmore. You know the name. I met him yesterday, in town." She quickly relayed the encounter, the smooth threats, the mention of the school board, Samuel's warning about Whitmore's men asking questions. With each detail, Ethan's expression grew darker, until by the end, he'd gone rigid with a fury so contained, it was almost worse than shouting. "He's moving faster than usual." Ethan's voice was low-controlled in a way that told her exactly how much effort that control required. "Cutting fences, running off cattle, that's not subtle for him. That's a message." "What kind of message?" "That he's tired of waiting for me to sell." Ethan turned to look out over the pasture, his scarred profile hard against the gray morning light. "He's wanted this valley since before my father died, Clara. Wanted the water rights, especially Caldwell land, sits on the only reliable spring for 6 miles, and every rancher downstream from here depends on what flows off this property. Whitmore's spent years trying to buy me out, and when that didn't work..." He stopped himself. "When that didn't work, what..." His jaw worked. "I've always believed he had something to do with the fire, never could prove it. The men who came that night wore no marks, gave no names, and by the time the sheriff arrived, there was nothing left to investigate but ash and 2 bodies. His hands had curled into fists at his sides. But the timing was too convenient. My father had refused Whitmore's offer 3 weeks before it happened. And within a year of the fire, Whitmore had bought up half the smaller parcels along the creek from families too frightened or too broke to hold on any longer. Clara felt something cold settle into her chest. "You think he's building toward the same thing again?" "I think a man who cuts fences today doesn't stop at fences." Ethan looked at her. Then something fierce and protective in his expression that made her breath catch. "Which is exactly why you need to stay away from this, Clara. If Whitmore's already asking questions about you in town, already threatening your position at the school, I'm not leaving because a bully in an expensive coat told me to. This isn't about pride. This is about a man who's proven at least once that he's willing to let people die for a piece of land." Ethan's voice cracked slightly on the last words, old grief bleeding through the anger. "I won't have that on my conscience, too. Then don't make decisions for me, as though I haven't got a mind of my own." Clara stepped closer, refusing to be managed, refusing to be protected into irrelevance, the way every man in her life had always tried to protect her, right out of any say in her own fate. "I came out here because I wanted to. I'll keep coming because I want to. If Whitmore doesn't like it, he can direct his complaints to me directly, instead of hiding behind cut fences and veiled threats to school children's families." Something in Ethan's expression shifted frustration warring with something that looked almost like awe. "You really aren't afraid of him." "I'm terrified of him," Clara admitted. "But I've spent my whole life being told what a woman is and isn't permitted to do. Ethan and I came 2,000 miles to stop listening to that particular chorus. I don't intend to start again now on account of one well-dressed bully with a grudge and too much money." For a long moment, he only looked at her, and something passed between them that neither seemed willing to name. Not yet, not with the weight of Whitmore's shadow stretched so long across the morning. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth lifted. "You are without question the most stubborn woman I have ever encountered. I'll take that as a compliment." It was meant as one. They walked the fence line together after that. Ethan pointing out where the wire had been cut with deliberate precision, rather than torn by animals or storm damage. And Clara found herself watching him more than the fence. The careful, methodical way he assessed the damage, the flashes of old grief that crossed his face whenever his gaze drifted toward the horizon, in the direction she realized of where the original house must have stood before the fire took it. "Show me," she said, finally stopping. "Where it happened, if you're willing." He went very still. "Why?" "Because I think you carry it alone every single day, and I don't think that's doing you any good at all." For a moment, she thought he'd refuse. His whole body seemed to brace against the request the way it had braced against her cloth on the ridge that first stormy night. Then, wordlessly, he turned and led her past the barn, past the small garden she'd noticed on her first visit to a stretch of blackened ground she hadn't seen before, half swallowed now by new grass, but still visible if a person knew to look the faint outline of a foundation-scorched stone that had never been cleared away. "I couldn't bring myself to build over it," he said quietly. "Every time I thought about it, He shook his head. It felt like erasing them. Clara stood beside him, looking at the ghost of a house that had once held a family, and said nothing at all, understanding instinctively that this moment required silence more than sympathy. "Mary Ellen doesn't come back," Ethan said after a long moment. "Not since the funeral. I don't blame her. Everything here reminds her of that night. I sometimes think she was the smart one leaving." He drew a slow breath. "I used to think I stayed out of duty. Lately I've started wondering if I stayed because leaving would mean admitting it's really over, that they're really gone. Grief doesn't work on a schedule anyone else can set for you. No." He looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "It doesn't. But you're the first person who's ever said that to me, instead of telling me it's been 6 years, that I should be over it by now, that a man my age ought to have moved on and found a wife and filled this house with something other than ghosts." "Is that what people say to you?" "When they bother to say anything at all, yes." A humorless smile touched his mouth. "Mostly they just look at my face and decide they already know everything about me they need to." Clara reached out slowly and touched the scarred side of his jaw, feeling him go rigid beneath her fingers, before gradually he allowed himself to lean just slightly into the contact. "I don't see what they see," she said softly. "I never have." "I know." His voice had gone rough. "That's what frightens me most, Clara. Not Whitmore. Not the fences. You." The peace of the moment didn't last the week. Clara arrived at the schoolhouse on Thursday morning to find 3 members of the town council already waiting inside, Mrs. Halloran among them, her expression carefully neutral in a way that promised nothing good. Along with 2 men Clara recognized only vaguely from church, both looking deeply uncomfortable to be there at all. Miss Whitfield. The eldest of the men, a thin, spectacled figure named Council President Harmon, cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. "We'd like a word if you have a moment before the children arrive." "Of course." Clara set down her satchel, already bracing herself. "Is something the matter?" "Concerns have been raised." Harmon exchanged a glance with his companions. "Regarding your associations, since arriving in Silver Creek." "My associations?" "With Ethan Caldwell." Mrs. Halloran said the name flatly, watching Clara's reaction with something that might almost have been sympathy beneath the stern exterior. Several prominent members of this community have expressed unease at the schoolteacher's judgment being called into question so early in her tenure. There is concern for the children's welfare given the history associated with that family. Clara felt her temper rising and forced it down with effort. "The children's welfare is precisely why I chose this profession, Mr. Harmon. I fail to see how tending an injured man's wounds threatens anyone's welfare." "It isn't only the tending that concerns us." One of the other men spoke up, younger, clearly less comfortable delivering the news than his colleagues. "It's been reported that you've continued visiting the Caldwell Ranch since. Alone, unescorted." Clara's stomach turned cold. Someone had been watching. Someone had been counting her visits, tracking her movements, reporting back, and she had a fairly clear idea of exactly whose interests were served by that surveillance. "I visit a patient to ensure his wound heals properly," she said, keeping her voice level through sheer force of will. "That is the entirety of my association with Mr. Caldwell. Be that as it may," Harmon said, not quite meeting her eyes, "the board has voted to place your appointment under review, pending further observation of your conduct. Should the visits continue, or should further concerns arise regarding your judgment, we would be forced to reconsider your position entirely." The words landed like a physical blow. Clara had crossed a continent, abandoned every connection to her old life, staked her entire future on this single position in this single town. And now, 3 strangers were threatening to strip it away over nothing more than an act of basic human decency. On what grounds precisely? Her voice had gone dangerously quiet. "I have broken no rule, violated no code of conduct. I have simply refused to abandon a wounded man because his neighbors have decided, for reasons none of you have yet managed to fully explain, that he doesn't deserve basic kindness." "The grounds?" Mrs. Halloran said, not unkindly. "Are that reputation in a town this size is a fragile thing, Miss Whitfield, and once it's spent, there's no earning it back. We are trying in our clumsy way to protect you from a mistake you may not yet understand the full cost of." "Or," Clara said, "you are trying to protect Mr. Whitmore's interests and using my reputation as the currency to do it." The silence that followed was total. Harmon's spectacles seemed to fog slightly with the sudden tension. The younger councilman looked at his shoes. Mrs. Halloran's mouth thinned into a hard line, but something flickered in her eyes that might, Clara thought, have been the tiniest flare of respect. "That is a serious accusation," Harmon said finally. "It's an observation," Clara replied. "Mr. Whitmore made his interest in my associations quite explicit to my face 2 days past in the middle of the Mercantile. I find it a remarkable coincidence that the town council shares his concerns so precisely down to the very timing of my visits." Nobody answered that. Nobody needed to. The truth of it sat in the room like a fourth unwelcome guest. "The children will be arriving shortly," Clara said into the silence, retrieving her satchel with hands that trembled only slightly. "I have a class to teach. I trust the board will inform me of its final decision through the proper channels rather than through gossip carried on the wind." She turned and busied herself at the front of the room, and after a long, uncomfortable moment, the 3 council members filed out without another word, leaving Clara alone with the growing, sickening certainty that Whitmore's reach extended further into Silver Creek than she'd ever imagined, and that her position, her home, her entire fragile new life was now balanced on a knife's edge because of a choice she would make again in an instant, given the chance. She didn't tell Ethan, not at first. She told herself it was because she didn't want to burden him further, didn't want to add her own troubles to the weight he already carried. The truth, when she was honest with herself on the ride home that evening, was closer to fear. Fear that if he knew the cost his presence was exacting from her, he would do exactly what he'd threatened, from the very first night on the ridge, and push her away for good, for her own protection, whether she wanted that protection or not. But secrets, she was quickly learning, did not survive long in a town the size of Silver Creek. Otis Grant found her 3 days later waiting near the schoolhouse steps after the children had gone home. An old, weathered man with hands scarred from decades at a forge, who Clara recognized as the town blacksmith, and she would soon learn one of the very few men in Silver Creek who had remained loyal to the Caldwell family through everything. "Miss Whitfield." He removed his cap, turning it over in gnarled hands, with obvious discomfort at the formality of the gesture. "Might I have a word?" "Of course, Mr. Grant." "Heard about the council meeting." He said it plainly without preamble, watching her face for reaction. "News like that don't stay quiet long in a town this size." Clara's throat tightened. "I'd rather Ethan not learn of it just yet if it's all the same to you." "That's exactly why I'm here, miss." Otis glanced around, lowering his voice, though the street was mostly empty. "Ethan's a good man. Best I ever knew, and I knew his father before him, God rest his soul. But he's got a habit of blaming himself for every bit of trouble that touches the people around him, whether it's his fault or not. If he hears the council's threatening your position on his account, He'll do something foolish. Sell the ranch to Whitmore just to make the trouble stop, most like or worse. Would that truly be so terrible if it kept people safe? Otis's weathered face creased into something between sorrow and frustration. You don't understand what that land means, miss. It ain't just dirt and water rights to him. It's the last piece of his family he's got left. His mother's roses still grow wild by where the porch used to stand. His father's initials are carved into the barn beam dated the year he built it with his own 2 hands. If Ethan gives that up, if Whitmore finally wins after all these years of trying, I don't know what's left of the man afterward. I genuinely don't. Clara felt something twist painfully in her chest. Then what would you have me do? Mr. Grant. Stand firm. He met her eyes directly, something fierce and hopeful in his weathered face. First time in 6 years I've seen that boy smile like he means it. First time I've seen him let anyone close enough to matter. Whatever the council threatens, whatever Whitmore schemes, don't let it scare you off. Ethan's had enough people leave him behind already. Don't you be one more. The weight of the old man's plea settled over her like a physical thing, and Clara found herself nodding before she'd fully decided to. I have no intention of leaving Mr. Grant, whatever it costs. Something like relief passed over his features. Good, good. Then there's something else you ought to know, seeing as you're determined to stay in this fight. He glanced around once more, then reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper worn soft at the creases, as though it had been handled many times. Found this jammed under a loose board in my forge few years back, left behind by a man who used to work for Whitmore's surveying crew before he disappeared from town entirely. Never made sense of it myself. Figured maybe you or Ethan might. Clara unfolded the paper with careful hands. It was a partial survey map, old and water-stained, marking out the boundaries of several properties along the creek, including, she realized with a jolt, the outline of Caldwell land itself, with strange annotations in a cramped, unfamiliar hand along the margins. Words like pending transfer and filed 1878 stood out amid figures she couldn't fully parse. 1878, she murmured. That's before the fire. 2 years before Nears, I can reckon. Otis's expression had darkened considerably. Never thought much of it till now, but you asked what Whitmore's after, and there it is in black and white, however cryptic it reads. Man's been planning something regarding that valley for a good deal longer than anybody realized. Clara's pulse had quickened, her mind already racing through the implications. Does Ethan know this exists? Never showed it to him. Didn't want to stir up grief over something I couldn't make full sense of. Otis shook his head slowly. But you're a school teacher, miss. Read more books than most folks in this territory put together, I'd wager. Maybe you can make sense of what an old blacksmith can't. She folded the map carefully, tucking it into her satchel, with hands that had begun faintly to tremble, not from fear this time, but from the electric certainty that she had just been handed a thread that, pulled correctly, might unravel whatever scheme Whitmore had been weaving across this valley for the better part of a decade. Thank you, Mr. Grant, she said quietly. I intend to find out exactly what this means. She rode out to the ranch that same evening, unable to wait even a single day, the map burning against her side, like a coal she couldn't set down. Ethan met her at the barn, and one look at her face was apparently enough to tell him something had shifted. What's happened? I need to show you something. She dismounted quickly, pulling the folded paper from her satchel, with fingers that had gone unsteady with urgency. Otis Grant gave this to me. Said he found it years ago, left behind by one of Whitmore's surveyors. Ethan took the map, and Clara watched his face carefully, as understanding dawned, watched the color drain slightly from his features. Watched his jaw tighten into something hard and dangerous. 1878, he said, echoing her earlier realization. 2 years before the fire. There's more. She pointed to the margin notes, the strange annotations she'd spent the ride puzzling over. These figures here, I believe they're property assessments. And this notation pending transfer, Ethan, I think Whitmore was already making arrangements to acquire this land 2 full years before your family died. Before he'd even made his final offer to your father. Ethan's hands had begun to shake, the paper trembling between his fingers. He was planning this before he ever approached my father directly, before any of the offers, any of the pressure. His voice had gone hollow, distant, the voice of a man recalculating 6 years of grief against an entirely new and more terrible shape. This isn't a man who wanted land and grew desperate when my father refused to sell. This is a man who had already decided he would have this valley one way or another, long before we ever knew we were in danger. We don't know for certain what it means, Clara said carefully, though her own instincts screamed otherwise. It could be an early assessment, nothing more, or it could be exactly what it looks like. Ethan's eyes had gone hard, glittering with a fury 6 years in the making. Proof that the fire wasn't some spontaneous act of greed that spiraled out of control. Proof that it was planned, that my family was never simply in the way of Whitmore's ambitions. We were the obstacle he'd already decided years in advance he was willing to remove by whatever means necessary. Clara reached for his arm, feeling the tension coiled beneath his skin like a wire pulled taut to breaking. Ethan, I need to know who this surveyor was, where he went, whether he's still alive to be asked. Ethan's voice had taken on a hard-focused edge that frightened her slightly. 6 years of buried rage suddenly finding a direction to travel. If there's proof, Clara, if there's any proof at all that Whitmore orchestrated what happened to my family, then we find it, Clara said firmly, cutting through the spiral before it could carry him somewhere reckless. Carefully, deliberately. Not by riding into town tonight and confronting a man who's already shown he's willing to threaten a schoolteacher's livelihood over far less than what we're now discussing. Ethan looked at her, and something in her steady, deliberate calm seemed to anchor him, pulling him back from the edge of whatever dark place the discovery had nearly sent him tumbling into. You're right. He exhaled slowly, forcing his hands to unclench. You're right. Whitmore's dangerous precisely because he's patient. If we move carelessly, we lose whatever advantage this gives us. We ask Otis about the surveyor first, Clara said, quietly, and I'll write to the Territorial Land Office in Helena, see what records exist of any filings from that period. If Whitmore truly submitted paperwork years before he made his offer public, there should be some trace of it, however carefully buried. Ethan looked down at the map again, at the faded ink that suddenly held the weight of his entire family's destruction, and something in his expression cracked open, not into fury this time, but into a grief so old and so deep that Clara felt her own throat close in sympathy. 6 years, he said quietly. 6 years I've told myself I imagined the timing was too convenient. 6 years everyone in this town told me I was chasing ghosts, looking for someone to blame because I couldn't accept a tragedy could simply happen without a villain behind it. His eyes met hers, wet and fierce. And it turns out I was right all along. We don't know that for certain yet, Clara said gently, though even she could hear how little conviction remained in the caution. No, Ethan agreed. But we're going to find out, whatever it costs. Yes. The following days passed in a strange, tense rhythm. Clara teaching by day, careful to give the town council no further grounds for complaint, while her evenings became consumed with careful, quiet investigation. She wrote her letter to the Helena Land Office, wording it as innocuously as she could manage, requesting records of any survey filings on the Caldwell property dating back to 1876. She said nothing further to Mrs. Halloran, nothing to anyone in town beyond Otis, who continued to watch over her with the gruff, protective concern of a man who had already decided without being asked that he would look after whatever came of this business. But Whitmore, it seemed, had grown impatient, waiting to see whether his warnings would take root. She found him waiting outside the schoolhouse one afternoon, nearly a week later, standing beside an expensive black carriage that looked entirely out of place against the dusty street. His expression pleasant in a way that had by now come to feel like a direct threat every single time she saw it. Miss Whitfield. He tipped his hat as the last of the children scattered toward home. A word if you have a moment. I'm rather busy, Mr. Whitmore. This won't take long. He fell into step beside her as she attempted to walk past his voice, dropping into something quieter, more pointed. I understand you've been making inquiries. Letters to the land office in Helena, I'm told. Curious research for a school teacher to be undertaking. Clara's blood ran cold, but she forced her expression to remain neutral. I fail to see how my correspondence is any concern of yours. Everything in this valley is my concern, Miss Whitfield. I've made it so over many years of careful investment. His pleasant tone had hardened at the edges, the mask slipping just enough to reveal something colder beneath. I would advise you as a friend to consider carefully what you're stirring up. Some questions once asked cannot be unasked, and some answers, Miss Whitfield, have a way of proving far more dangerous to seek than to simply leave buried. Is that a threat, Mr. Whitmore? It's a kindness. His smile had gone thin and sharp as a blade. The same kindness I extended once before to a family who refused to heed it. I'd hate to see history repeat itself with someone as promising as yourself. The words landed like a physical blow, and for a moment Clara couldn't breathe, because there in that single sentence, delivered with such smooth, practiced menace, was something dangerously close to a confession. Are you telling me, she said slowly, forcing her voice not to shake, that you had something to do with what happened to the Caldwell family? Whitmore's eyes glittered cold and amused, and he said nothing at all. Simply tipped his hat once more, climbed into his carriage and rode away, leaving Clara standing frozen on the empty street, with his silence ringing in her ears louder than any confession could have the full and terrible shape of what she and Ethan were truly facing, finally, unmistakably clear. Clara didn't remember the ride back to Caldwell Ranch. One moment she was standing frozen on the empty street, watching Whitmore's carriage vanish around the corner, and the next she was pulling her horse up hard in front of the barn. Breathless, her hands shaking so badly, she nearly dropped the reins. Ethan came out at the sound of hooves, and one look at her face brought him running. Clara, what happened? Whitmore. She half fell from the saddle, and he caught her arm before she could stumble. He was waiting for me outside the schoolhouse. He knew about the letter to Helena. Ethan, he knew before I'd even sent it more than a week. Ethan's face went very still. Someone's reading your mail, or someone at the land office is on his payroll. The thought made her stomach turn. He told me some questions can't be unasked, that some answers are more dangerous to find than to leave buried. She forced herself to meet his eyes, watching the color drain from his scarred face as she said the rest. He said he'd hate to see history repeat itself with someone as promising as myself, the same way it repeated itself with a family who refused to listen once before. For a long moment, Ethan said nothing at all. Then something broke loose behind his eyes. 6 years of grief and suspicion finally given a shape sharp enough to cut. He just confessed. He didn't confess anything outright. It could be read as, he confessed Clara. Ethan's voice had dropped low and hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. I've waited 6 years for someone to slip. 6 years of every soul in this territory telling me I imagined a conspiracy because I couldn't accept my family died for no reason at all. And now the man himself stands on a public street and all but says it to your face, which is exactly why we can't move recklessly now. Clara caught his arm before he could turn toward the barn, toward his horse, toward whatever furious confrontation was clearly building behind his eyes. If you ride into town and put your hands on Charles Whitmore, you hand him precisely what he needs. A charge. A reason to have you locked up or worse. He's spent 6 years building a wall of respectability around himself. We tear it down with proof, not with your fists. Ethan's jaw worked, fury and reason warring visibly across his face. And for one terrible second Clara thought he might pull away from her entirely and ride off anyway. Then slowly some of the tension went out of his shoulders, and he exhaled a long, shuddering breath. You're right. He said it like the words cost him something physical. You're right. God help me, I hate that you're right. We need the surveyor, Clara said. The one who left that map with Otis. If he's alive, if he can be found, he's the only living soul who might testify to what that filing actually means. If he's alive. Ethan's voice had gone grim. A man vanishes from Whitmore's crew right around the time my family dies and leaves behind evidence tying Whitmore to this valley 2 years before the fire. That's not the profile of a man who simply moved on to better opportunities elsewhere. Then we find out what happened to him, carefully. Clara held his gaze, willing him to hear her. We go to Otis together tonight. He's the only one who might know where to start looking. Yeah. Otis Grant's forge sat dark and quiet by the time they reached town. The old blacksmith himself just banking his fire for the night when Ethan's shadow fell across the doorway. Didn't expect to see you in town after dark, boy. Otis's weathered face creased with immediate concern at the look on both their faces. Something's happened. Whitmore all but confessed to Clara this afternoon, Ethan said without preamble. We need to know about the surveyor, the one who left you that map. Otis went very still, glancing toward the darkened street behind them, before drawing them both further into the shadow of the forge. Name was Daniel Reeves. Kept to himself mostly, though he'd stop by now and again to have his tools sharpened, talk a bit while he waited. Good man, far as I could tell. Uneasy sort, especially in that last year before he disappeared. Disappeared how? Clara asked. One day he was in town drinking quiet at the saloon, looking over his shoulder like a man expecting trouble. Next day gone. Left his boarding room paid through the month, left most of his belongings behind, never said a word of farewell to a soul I knew of. Otis's expression darkened. Word went round he'd simply moved on, taken work somewhere else. Nobody questioned it much. Men drift through this territory all the time. But you didn't believe it, Ethan said. Found that map jammed under a floorboard in my forge, not 2 weeks after, hidden careful like a man meaning to come back for it, and never got the chance. Otis's jaw tightened. I always figured he'd left it with me on purpose, meaning it as insurance of some kind, and something happened before he could ever collect it or make use of it himself. Do you know where he might have gone? Clara pressed. Family, a hometown, anywhere he might have fled to. Otis was quiet a long moment, weighing something behind his tired eyes. Heard once secondhand that he had a sister up in Bozeman. Never confirmed it myself. Never had reason to go looking, not until now. Bozeman's 2 days' ride, Ethan said, already calculating. Ethan? Clara's voice carried a warning. If you ride out of Silver Creek now in the middle of everything, Whitmore's already stirring up. Then I'll be back before he notices I'm gone. His eyes were fierce, determined in a way she hadn't seen since the night on the ridge. Clara, this is the first real thread we've had in 6 years. I have to follow it. Then I'm coming with you. Absolutely not. He turned to face her fully. You have a position to protect a school full of children, depending on you, a council already looking for any excuse to be rid of you. If you vanish from Silver Creek for 4 days chasing a lead with me, you hand them exactly what they want. Clara wanted to argue every stubborn instinct in her rebelling against being left behind. But the truth of what he said settled over her, cold and undeniable. Then go carefully. And Ethan? She caught his sleeve as he turned to leave. If you find him, if Daniel Reeves is alive and willing to speak, we'll need more than his word. We'll need something written, something sworn, something that can stand against a man with Whitmore's money in reach. I know. Something softened in his expression, despite the urgency of the moment. I'll bring back whatever I can, I promise you that. He rode out before dawn, and Clara spent the following days in a state of raw, gnawing anxiety that she was forced to hide behind the ordinary rhythms of chalk dust and multiplication tables. 17 small faces looking up at her, utterly unaware of the war being waged just beyond the schoolhouse walls. The first blow came on the second day of his absence, and it came from a direction Clara hadn't fully anticipated. She arrived at the schoolhouse to find a small crowd already gathered outside, not children but adults, parents, several faces she recognized from church and the mercantile, all of them wearing expressions ranging from discomfort to open hostility. Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Halloran stepped forward from the group, her face tight with something that looked almost like pity beneath the sternness. There's a matter that needs discussing before you begin lessons this morning. What's happened? There's talk going around town. One of the fathers spoke up, a burly man named Perkins, whose daughter sat in Clara's front row. Talk that Caldwell's been filling your head with wild stories. Accusations against Mr. Whitmore. Talk that you've let yourself be turned against decent, respectable folk by a man everybody knows has never been right in the head since that fire. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her, understanding instantly what she was facing. Who told you this? Does it matter who told us? A woman near the back. Clara recognized her as one of Whitmore's tenants from the notes Otis had shown her, a family renting land along the eastern boundary of his holdings. Question is whether it's true. Whether you've been out at that ranch getting filled up with lies about a respected businessman on account of some grudge Caldwell's nursed for 6 years. They aren't lies. The words left Clara before she could stop them sharper than she intended. I've seen evidence with my own eyes suggesting Mr. Whitmore's interest in this valley predates the tragedy that took Ethan's family by years, not months. I would think as parents you'd want the truth investigated rather than dismissed simply because it's uncomfortable to hear. A ripple of unease moved through the small crowd, several faces exchanging uncertain glances. That's a serious thing to be saying about a man like Whitmore, Perkins said slowly. Serious enough it oughtn't be said without proof standing behind it. I intend to have proof. Clara held her ground despite the churning fear in her stomach. And when I do, I'll bring it before this entire town, not whisper it in corners the way certain other rumors seem to travel. Careful, Miss Whitfield. Mrs. Halloran's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle, which somehow frightened Clara more than open hostility would have. You're speaking dangerously close to accusing a powerful man of terrible things on the word of someone this whole territory already considers unreliable at best. Think very carefully about where that path leads you. The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering amongst themselves, and Clara stood alone on the schoolhouse steps, feeling for the first time since arriving in Silver Creek, truly and completely isolated. The second blow came that same afternoon, delivered by Council President Harmon himself. His spectacled face grave as he handed her a folded letter outside the schoolhouse door. The board has reached a decision, Miss Whitfield. His voice carried genuine regret, though not enough to change whatever verdict the paper held. Given the mounting concerns regarding your judgment and associations, your appointment has been suspended pending a formal review. You may continue instruction for the remainder of this week, but a permanent decision will be reached by the board within the fortnight. Clara's hands trembled as she took the letter, the weight of everything she'd risked crashing down at once. On what grounds precisely? I have taught these children faithfully. I have broken no law, harmed no child, neglected no duty. The grounds are stated within. Harmon wouldn't quite meet her eyes. I am sorry, Miss Whitfield, truly, but the pressure from certain influential quarters of this community has made the board's position untenable. You mean Whitmore's pressure? Harmon flinched slightly at the directness of it, but said nothing, which was in its own way confirmation enough. Clara watched him walk away, the letter shaking in her grip, and felt something inside her that had been bending under the accumulated weight of the past 2 weeks finally threatened to snap entirely. She thought of her father, of Boston, of the disgrace that had chased her 2,000 miles, only to find her again here in a town she'd hoped might finally offer her a life entirely her own. She would not let it happen again, not without a fight. Ethan returned on the fourth night, exhausted, his horse lathered from hard riding, and the moment Clara saw his face in the lamplight of the ranch house, she knew he'd found something. Daniel Reeves is alive, he said, before she'd even finished crossing the yard to meet him. Living outside Bozeman under a different name. Took considerable convincing before he'd even speak to me, and longer still before he'd agree to put anything in writing. And Ethan reached into his coat and withdrew a folded sealed document, his hand shaking slightly as he held it out to her. A sworn statement, notarized by a lawyer in Bozeman willing to put his own name behind it. Reeves confirms everything the map suggested and more. Whitmore submitted preliminary transfer paperwork on Caldwell land in 1878, 2 full years before my father was ever formally approached to sell. Reeves was tasked with surveying the property under false pretenses, told it was for a county water assessment, not for Whitmore's private acquisition. Clara's heart pounded as she unfolded the document with careful hands, scanning the cramped, careful handwriting within. This alone proves premeditation. Whitmore wanted this land years before the fire, and he was already making arrangements to claim it long before your father ever refused him. There's more. Ethan's voice had gone tight raw with old grief resurfacing sharp and fresh. Reeves says he overheard a conversation between Whitmore and another man weeks before the fire, discussing his words not mine how to remove the obstacle on the North Valley property should persuasion continue to fail. Ethan's jaw clenched hard enough that Clara could see the muscle working beneath his scarred skin. He didn't hear a name attached to the fire directly. He fled the territory before he could learn, more terrified for his own life after realizing what he might have stumbled into. But the timeline, the language, the intent. It's enough, Clara breathed. Ethan, this is enough to force a real investigation. Not whispers, not suspicion, sworn testimony, notarized from a man with no reason left to lie. It's a start. Something fierce and exhausted moved across his face. But Clara, a document from a man 300 miles away, isn't going to convince a town that's already decided who to believe. We'll need to bring this before people directly. Before the council. Before the sheriff. Somewhere it can't simply be dismissed as more of Ethan Caldwell's grudge against a respected businessman. Clara told him then about the suspension, about the letter, about the crowd outside the schoolhouse, and watched fresh fury and guilt war across his features in equal measure. This is exactly what I feared, he said, voice rough. You've lost your position because of me. I haven't lost anything yet. Clara folded the document carefully, tucking it against her chest like something precious. And I don't intend to. There's a town meeting scheduled for Saturday regarding the new grain tax the council's proposing. Half of Silver Creek will be there. If we're going to bring this before the community, that's our chance. A room already full, an audience already gathered, no way for Whitmore to quietly steer the conversation elsewhere. Clara, if we do this publicly and it goes wrong, if we don't do it publicly, nothing changes at all. She met his eyes steadily. You've spent 6 years letting this town believe whatever it wanted about you hiding on this ranch, because it was easier than fighting a battle you didn't think you could win. I understand why. But I refuse to let that same fear cost us the one real chance we've had to prove the truth. Something in her voice and the fierce certainty of her expression seemed to settle something in him. He nodded slowly, though the fear in his eyes hadn't fully faded. Saturday then, sir. The days leading to the meeting stretched taut with a tension Clara could feel in every corner of Silver Creek. She continued teaching, though the suspension hung over her like a blade waiting to fall, and more than once she caught whispered conversations that died the moment she entered a room. Otis kept careful watch over both of them in those days, riding out to the ranch each evening, under cover of visiting for supplies, quietly confirming that no further sabotage had struck the Caldwell fences, that Whitmore's men hadn't been spotted prowling the property line again. But on the Friday before the meeting, everything shifted with terrible speed. Clara was walking home from the schoolhouse when Sheriff Ashford intercepted her outside the boarding house, his expression grimmer than she'd ever seen it. Miss Whitfield, a word. Something in his tone made her stomach drop immediately. What's happened? There's been an accusation filed against Caldwell. Ashford's jaw was tight, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he was about to say. Whitmore's claiming Ethan assaulted one of his men out near the property line 2 nights past. Says the man's laid up with a broken arm and a story about Caldwell attacking him without provocation. That's a lie. Clara's voice came out sharper than she intended. Ethan's been on his own property every night this week. I can vouch for it. Can you vouch for every single hour, Miss Whitfield, or only the ones you happened to witness yourself? Ashford's tone wasn't cruel, but it carried the weight of a man caught between duty and doubt. Whitmore's filed formal charges. I've got no choice but to bring Ethan in for questioning, whatever either of us might privately believe about how convenient the timing looks. The words landed like a physical blow. You're going to arrest him. 2 days before he's meant to present evidence that could implicate Whitmore in a 6-year-old conspiracy. Something flickered in Ashford's weathered face, the first real crack of doubt Clara had seen from him since the night on the ranch porch. "I don't like the timing any better than you do, Miss Whitfield. But I've got a formal complaint and an injured man swearing testimony, and unless somebody can produce evidence saying different, my hands are tied by the law, same as anyone else's." "Then I'll produce it," Clara said, desperation sharpening her voice. "Give me until Saturday, the town meeting. Let him present what he's found before you drag him off on a fabricated charge timed to silence him." Ashford studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his tired eyes. "Saturday," he said finally. "But I'll be watching close, Miss Whitfield, and if this turns out to be exactly the kind of trouble I think it might, I won't be able to protect either of you from what comes after." She rode to warn Ethan that same evening, finding him at the barn, and watched his face harden into something cold and resigned as she relayed what Ashford had told her. "He's moving faster than we expected," Ethan said quietly, "trying to discredit me before I ever get the chance to speak. We still have Saturday. If Ashford doesn't change his mind before then, if Whitmore doesn't manufacture some new accusation to force an arrest sooner." Ethan's hands had curled into fists, old fury and fresh fear tangled together. "I should have known he wouldn't simply wait to see what I'd found. A man who orchestrates a fire doesn't hesitate to orchestrate a false charge. Then we make sure Saturday happens before he can stop it." Clara reached for his hand, steadying him the way she had that first stormy night on the ridge. "We have Reeves's statement. We have the map. We have Otis willing to testify to where he found it and when. It's enough, Ethan. It has to be enough. And if it isn't—" His voice cracked slightly raw with a fear she rarely saw him allow himself to show. "If I stand up in that meeting hall and the town simply refuses to believe 6 years of whispers were wrong all along. If Whitmore's got the council, the sheriff's hesitation, half the town's debts in his pocket, and I've got nothing but a piece of paper from a frightened man 300 miles away." Clara stepped closer, taking his face gently between her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "Then we'll have told the truth regardless of whether they choose to hear it. But Ethan, I don't believe that's what will happen. I've watched you long enough to know the man beneath these scars, and I refuse to believe an entire town is so blind they can't eventually see it too." Something in his expression cracked open at that raw and grateful and afraid all at once, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the weight of everything unsaid between them, settling into something that felt, despite the danger pressing in from every side, dangerously close to hope. Saturday arrived with a clear sky and a town hall packed tighter than Clara had ever seen it. Every bench filled latecomers, standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. She'd expected perhaps half the town might attend, given the grain tax on the agenda. She hadn't expected every soul in Silver Creek to turn out drawn, she suspected, by rumors of exactly the confrontation she and Ethan intended to force. Whitmore sat near the front, composed and immaculate as always, exchanging quiet words with Council President Harmon, as though nothing in the world troubled him. Sheriff Ashford stood near the door, arms crossed, watching the room with careful, wary attention. Ethan arrived beside Clara, just as the meeting was called to order, his jaw set, his scarred face turned fully toward the crowd rather than angled away, as it so often was in public. She could feel the tension radiating off him, could see the effort it cost him simply to stand there beneath the weight of so many watching eyes. The grain tax business proceeded with agonizing slowness, and Clara felt every minute stretch taut with anticipation, watching Whitmore's composed profile, waiting for the moment their carefully planned confrontation would finally arrive. When Harmon finally called for any additional matters before the town, Ethan stepped forward. A murmur rippled through the crowd, instantly surprise, unease, curiosity, all tangled together. "I have something that needs to be said before this town." Ethan began, his voice carrying clear and steady despite the visible tremor in his hands. "Something that concerns every family who's ever wondered why my father refused to sell his land, why my family died in a fire 6 years ago that nobody could ever fully explain, and why Charles Whitmore has spent every year since quietly acquiring the land around mine, one desperate family at a time." "Sit down, Caldwell," A voice from the crowd, hostile though Clara couldn't identify the speaker. "Nobody wants to hear your grudges again." "Let him speak." Otis's voice rising from near the front, surprising Clara with its steadiness. "Some of us would like to hear the truth, whatever shape it takes." Whitmore rose smoothly, his expression the picture of patient, wounded dignity. "President Harmon, I understand grief runs deep in some souls, and I've borne Mr. Caldwell's accusations with as much patience as any man could reasonably muster over the years. But surely this meeting isn't the place to air old wounds that have already been thoroughly examined and laid to rest." "They were never examined," Ethan said, turning to face him directly for the first time in 6 years of careful avoidance. "They were dismissed. There's a difference, Whitmore, and I think you understand that difference better than anyone in this room." A tense murmur swept the crowd. Harmon looked between the two men with visible discomfort, clearly torn between decorum and the electric charge now filling the hall. "Mr. Caldwell," Harmon said carefully, "if you have something specific to present, the council will hear it. But I must caution you against baseless accusations against a respected member of this community. They aren't baseless." Clara stepped forward beside Ethan, her voice ringing clear through the packed hall, despite the fear coiling tight in her chest. "I have in my possession a sworn notarized statement from a man named Daniel Reeves, formerly employed as a surveyor by Mr. Whitmore, confirming that survey work was conducted on Caldwell property in 1878, 2 full years before the fire that killed Ethan's parents, and long before Mr. Whitmore ever publicly approached the family with an offer to purchase their land. Giki, join na timaen. The murmur swelled into open noise, now faces turning toward Whitmore, whose composed expression had for the first time begun to show the faintest crack of tension. "This is absurd," Whitmore said, his voice carrying less smooth confidence than before. "A single, unverified document from a man nobody in this room has ever met. Notarized in Bozeman by a licensed attorney whose name and credentials are included within—" Clara continued raising the document for the room to see. "Mr. Reeves further attests to overhearing a conversation between Mr. Whitmore and an unnamed associate weeks before the fire, discussing the need to remove the obstacle standing between Mr. Whitmore and this valley's water rights." The hall erupted into a roar of overlapping voices, shock and disbelief and dawning suspicion crashing together, and Clara watched Whitmore's face transform in real time, the careful mask cracking fully now, revealing something colder and more dangerous beneath. "Order. Order, please." Harmon's voice cracked with the effort of restoring calm, banging his hand against the podium repeatedly. "This is a serious accusation, and it will not be settled through shouting in a public meeting hall. It's a fabrication," Whitmore said, his voice tight now, all pretense of patient dignity gone. "A convenient story constructed by a bitter, damaged man, and a woman who's clearly allowed herself to be manipulated by his obsession." "I haven't been manipulated by anyone, Mr. Whitmore." Clara's voice cut through the noise steady, despite the fury building in her chest. "I've simply asked the questions nobody in this town was willing to ask for 6 years. Questions about convenient timing, about cut fences, about fabricated assault charges filed 2 days before evidence was set to be presented, about a man who threatened my employment, my safety, and my reputation the moment I refused to simply look away." "She's telling the truth." Otis's voice rose again from the crowd, firm and unwavering. "I found that map myself years back, hidden in my own forge by a man who vanished from this town not long after Whitmore's crew stopped needing him. I never made full sense of it till now, but I'll swear before God and this whole town that everything Miss Whitfield's just said matches exactly what I found." More voices began rising now, not all in Ethan's favor, but enough uncertainty rippling through the crowd that Whitmore's composure had fully abandoned him. His face flushed with a fury he could no longer fully contain. "This is nothing but slander," he snapped, "and I will not stand here and be accused by a woman whose judgment this very council has already called into serious question, and a man this entire town has quietly pitied for years precisely because his mind never fully recovered from that fire's trauma." The words landed like a slap, and Clara felt Ethan flinch beside her old wounds, tearing open in front of the entire town he'd spent 6 years hiding from. But instead of retreating, instead of the silence and withdrawal, she half expected something in his posture straightened. "You want to talk about my mind, Whitmore?" Ethan's voice had gone low, dangerous, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "Let's talk about the night of that fire then, since you seem so eager to revisit it. Let's talk about how the men who came weren't strangers passing through. They knew exactly where my father kept his rifle, exactly which building to burn first to draw us into the open, exactly how long it would take help to arrive from town. That's not the work of drifters or thieves, Whitmore. That's the work of men who'd been paid and paid well by someone who wanted this land badly enough to burn a family alive to get it." The hall had gone utterly silent now, every eye fixed on the two men facing each other across the narrow aisle, the entire town holding its breath. "You have no proof of that," Whitmore said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, something almost like panic flickering beneath the fury now. "I have a survey filed 2 years before the fire," Ethan said. "I have a witness who overheard you discussing the need to remove obstacles from this valley. I have 6 years of cut fences, stolen cattle, and threats delivered to anyone who dared show me a moment's kindness." His voice cracked, finally raw grief bleeding through the fury. "I have a face that carries the scars of that night every single day, Whitmore, and I have spent 6 years believing I deserved this town's suspicion because I couldn't prove what I always knew in my bones to be true. But I know it now, and so does everyone in this room." For a long, terrible moment, nobody spoke. Whitmore stood frozen at the front of the hall, his composure entirely shattered, his eyes darting across the crowd, as though searching for some ally who might rescue him from the wreckage of his own unraveling reputation. Then Sheriff Ashford stepped forward from the back wall, his expression grim and resolved. "Charles Whitmore, given the evidence presented here today, I'll be requiring you to accompany me to my office for formal questioning. Should the Territorial Marshal's office confirm what's been alleged, further charges may follow." "This is an outrage!" Whitmore snapped, backing away, as murmurs of shock and anger rippled through the crowd around him. "I have done nothing but build this community with my own resources for a decade, and you would take the word of a broken man and a—" "Careful, Whitmore," Ashford said quietly, his hand resting meaningfully near his hip. "I'd think very carefully about what you say next, given the room you're standing in and the mood it's currently in." Whitmore's eyes swept the hall one final time. The faces that had once deferred to him, now watching with open suspicion, the businessmen who owed him money, now edging subtly away, as though proximity itself might prove contagious, and something in his expression finally fully broke. He turned and bolted for the side door. The hall erupted into chaos, shouts rising as several men moved to block his path, and in the crush of bodies and noise, Clara lost sight of him entirely. Her heart hammering as Ethan's hand found hers and gripped tight. "Ethan, I see him." His voice was tight, urgent, already pulling her toward the door through the crush of the crowd. "He's not getting away, not after everything." But even as they pushed toward the exit, Clara caught sight of something through the window that stopped her cold. Whitmore already outside, already mounting a horse, held ready by one of his men, and in his hand, catching the afternoon light, unmistakably the glint of a pistol. "Ethan, he's armed." The warning came too late. A single gunshot cracked through the chaos of the hall, and the crowd surged backward in a wave of screams. And Clara felt Ethan's hand tear from hers as he lunged toward the door, toward the sound. Toward the man who had already once tried to erase his family from this valley, and now, cornered and desperate, seemed fully prepared to finish what that long-ago fire had failed to complete. The scream that followed the gunshot came from Clara's own throat before she even realized she'd made a sound. She shoved through the crush of bodies pouring out the town hall doors, elbows and shoulders knocking against her, and burst into the daylight just in time to see Ethan on the ground. One hand pressed hard against his shoulder, dark red already blooming between his fingers. Ethan! He was still moving, struggling up onto one knee, teeth gritted alive, and the relief that crashed through her was so violent it nearly buckled her knees. Whitmore was already 30 yards down the street, spurring his horse hard toward the tree line at the edge of town, his hired man close behind him. "Stop him!" Sheriff Ashford's voice roared over the chaos, already sprinting for his own mount. "Somebody stop that horse!" Clara didn't stop to see if anyone obeyed. She dropped to her knees beside Ethan, hands flying to the wound, some detached clinical part of her mind, the same part that had saved his life on that storm-lashed ridge 2 weeks earlier, already assessing, already working. Let me see it, Ethan." "I'm fine." His voice was tight with pain, sweat beading along his hairline despite the cool afternoon air. "Went through the meat of the shoulder. Missed anything that matters. You don't get to decide that from the ground bleeding into the dirt." She tore at his shirt with hands that had gone steady the moment there was work to focus on exposing the wound. And he was right. Thank God it had passed clean through the muscle of his upper shoulder without catching bone. Painful. Bloody. Survivable. Hold still. Around them, the street had erupted into full chaos. Women pulling children back into doorways. Men shouting after Ashford as he thundered past on horseback in pursuit of Whitmore's fleeing shape. Otis Grant pushing through the crowd with his old face gone white with fear. "Ethan, Miss Whitfield, is he?" "He'll live," Clara said, pressing her balled-up shawl hard against the wound, watching Ethan's jaw clench against the pain. "Get Dr. Bennett. Now Otis, please." Otis vanished back into the crowd at a dead run, and Clara turned her full attention back to Ethan, who had gone pale, but was watching her with an expression that, despite everything, held something almost like wonder. "You didn't run," he said quietly through gritted teeth. "Why would I run?" "Most people run from gunfire, Clara. I'm not most people." She kept pressure steady on the wound, refusing to let her hands shake despite the adrenaline still crashing through her system. "And you already knew that, or you wouldn't keep being so surprised by it." A weak, pained laugh escaped him, quickly swallowed by a hiss of pain as she adjusted her grip. "Fair point." Dr. Bennett arrived within minutes, a wiry, efficient man who took one look at the wound and pronounced Ethan fortunate. In the same breath, he ordered him carried to his office 2 doors down. Clara walked beside the makeshift stretcher the entire way, refusing every suggestion that she step back and let the men handle it, and stayed through the probing and cleaning and stitching that followed. Holding Ethan's uninjured hand while he ground his jaw against sounds, he refused even now to let escape. It was nearly an hour before Sheriff Ashford returned. His horse lathered, his expression grim in a way that told its own story before he'd said a single word. "He's gone," Ashford said, stepping into the crowded little office where half the town seemed to have gathered in the hallway outside, anxious for news. "Whitmore got a decent head start, and his man laid down enough cover fire on the tree line that I lost the trail before I could close the gap. I've sent word to the territorial marshal's office and every outlying town within 2 days' ride. He won't get far without somebody spotting him. He shot Ethan in front of half this town," Clara said, disbelief and fury tangling in her voice. "In front of witnesses, and he simply rode away. For now." Ashford's jaw was tight. "But a man like Whitmore doesn't disappear easy." "Miss Whitfield, he's got money tied up in 6 ventures across this territory land. He can't simply abandon associates who'll want their own debts settled whether he's running or not. My money says he goes to ground somewhere close, waiting to see how this shakes out rather than vanishing for good." Ethan, propped up on the examination table with fresh bandages wound tight across his shoulder, spoke for the first time since the doctor had finished his work. "He'll come back for the ranch if nothing else. He's spent too many years chasing that land to let one bad afternoon in a town meeting be the end of it. Maybe." Ashford's expression had shifted since the meeting. Something in his weathered face that looked almost like guilt, almost like a man recalculating years of quiet dismissal. "I owe you an apology, Caldwell. Been sheriff of this town 6 years, watched you carry suspicion you never deserved the whole while, and never once dug deep enough to wonder if there was more to your story than folks wanted to believe. You believe it now. I believe a man doesn't put a bullet in another man's shoulder and run for the hills unless he's got considerably more to hide than wounded pride." Ashford's jaw tightened. I'll be filing formal charges the moment we run him down. Attempted murder at minimum, on top of whatever the marshal's office turns up regarding the fire itself, once they've had time to examine what Miss Whitfield's evidence points toward. Clara felt something loosen in her chest for the first time in what felt like weeks. Not quite relief, not yet. Not with Whitmore still free somewhere beyond the tree line. But something close to it. Something like the first real crack of daylight after a very long storm. The town shifted in the days that followed, slowly at first, and then all at once, the way ice breaks on a lake in early spring, small fractures spreading until the whole surface gives way together. Mrs. Halloran was the first to come calling at the boarding house 2 days after the shooting, her face carrying an expression Clara had never once seen on it before, something close to shame. "I owe you an apology, Miss Whitfield." She stood stiffly in the doorway of Clara's room, hands twisted together in front of her apron. "I let myself be swayed by a man's money and reputation over a young woman's plain honesty, and I am not proud of how quickly I was willing to believe the worst of you, rather than take the time to ask harder questions. You weren't the only one, Mrs. Halloran. No. But I was meant to know better." The older woman's chin lifted slightly, some of her familiar sternness returning even through the apology. "The councils voted to reinstate your position effective immediately, and to strike the suspension from any record. I argued for it myself for whatever small measure that's worth after everything." Something in Clara's throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you." "Don't thank me too quickly. This town's got a long habit of forgetting its own mistakes rather than learning from them." Mrs. Halloran's eyes softened just slightly. "But for what it's worth, Miss Whitfield, I hope you'll consider staying once all this settles. Silver Creek could use a school teacher with your particular brand of stubbornness." She left before Clara could formulate any response beyond a startled, grateful nod, and Clara sat alone in her small room for a long while. Afterward, turning over the strange, unfamiliar warmth of finally being seen, truly seen, by a town that had spent weeks looking straight through her. She rode out to Caldwell Ranch that evening to find Ethan on the porch, his arm still bound in a sling, but his color returning, watching the sunset over land that for the first time in 6 years might finally truly belong to him, without a shadow hanging over it. "Mrs. Halloran came by," she said, settling onto the porch step beside him. "The council's reinstated my position. Good." Something in his voice carried real relief. "I've hated the thought that any of this cost you what you came here for." "It hasn't cost me anything I wasn't willing to risk." She looked out at the darkening fields. The quiet punctuated only by the distant call of some night bird settling into the trees. "Any word on Whitmore?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Ashford sent a rider this afternoon, spotted near the territorial border heading north, but he slipped past a checkpoint before they could close on him. Still running." He shook his head slowly. "Man's got resources scattered across 3 territories from what the marshal's office is turning up now that they're finally looking. This isn't over, Clara, not by a long measure." "I know." She reached for his good hand, lacing her fingers through his. "But it's different now. The whole town knows the truth now. Whatever he does from here, he does it as a fugitive, not a respected businessman with the town's sympathy in his pocket. That's something," Ethan admitted. "It's not everything, but it's something." He turned to look at her, something softer moving across his scarred features in the fading light. "I don't think I ever properly thanked you. For any of it. The ridge, the council meeting, standing up in that hall today in front of the whole town and saying what needed saying when you had every reason in the world to simply protect yourself and let this be my fight alone, to lose. It stopped being just your fight a while ago, Ethan." She squeezed his hand gently. "Somewhere between the storm on that ridge and the fence line and the map Otis handed me, it became ours." Something in his expression cracked open at that, not into words, not yet, but into a look so raw and unguarded that Clara felt her own breath catch in her throat. "Clara." Whatever he'd been about to say was interrupted by the sound of hooves on the road, fast and urgent, and both of them turned sharply toward the sound, every muscle tensing at the memory of exactly how quickly danger had found them before. But it was only Otis riding hard, his old face grim with news that couldn't wait for morning. "Sheriff's men cornered him," Otis said, breathless, pulling his horse up short in front of the porch. "Whitmore, holed up in an abandoned line shack near the northern pass, trying to wait out the search before making a break for the Canadian line. Ashford's riding out with a posse at first light. Wanted you both to know before it happened, given everything." Ethan was already on his feet, wincing against the pull of his healing wound. "I'm going." "Ethan, your shoulder." "I've waited 6 years for this, Clara." His voice carried a quiet, unshakable resolve. "I'm not sitting on this porch while another man decides how the story ends." They rode out before dawn alongside Ashford's posse, 6 men in all, beyond the sheriff himself, moving cautiously through the gray, cold light toward the line shack Otis had described, tucked into a fold of the mountains where the northern pass narrowed between 2 steep ridges. Clara had argued fiercely against coming at all, and lost just as fiercely, Ethan's stubbornness meeting her own head-on until Ashford himself had finally intervened. "She stays back at the tree line with Otis," Ashford had said in a tone that brooked no further argument. "That's not negotiable, Caldwell, and you know it, but she's earned the right to see this through to the end, given everything she's risked to get us here." So Clara waited now at the edge of the trees, her heart hammering, watching through the pale morning light as Ashford's men fanned out in a slow, careful arc around the weathered old shack, rifles ready, voices pitched low. "Charles Whitmore." Ashford's voice carried clear across the clearing, authoritative and unwavering. "This is Sheriff Ashford. The shack's surrounded. There's no path out of this but through us. Come out with your hands showing, and we'll see you get a fair trial for whatever the marshal's investigation turns up." Silence answered him, long and taut, broken only by the wind moving through the pines. "Whitmore, I'm not going to hang for something a jury of frightened farmers decides they believe." The voice that finally answered was ragged, desperate, nothing like the smooth, controlled tone Clara had heard in the mercantile weeks earlier. "You come any closer, Ashford, and I swear before God I'll—" The threat died unfinished, and something in the silence that followed made every hair on Clara's arms stand on end. "Ethan," she breathed, though he was far too distant to hear her, watching him from her position at the tree line as he stood beside Ashford, tense and still, his rifle held ready in his uninjured arm. "He's cornered," Otis murmured beside her, his own weathered face tight with worry. "Desperate men do desperate things, miss. Whatever happens next, you keep your head down, and your eyes on Ethan. You hear me?" The standoff stretched for what felt like an eternity. Ashford, calling out twice more offers of surrender, met each time with increasingly frantic, incoherent threats from within the shack. Clara's fingers dug into the bark of the pine tree she stood beside, her whole body coiled with a fear so sharp it felt almost physical. Then, without warning, the shack door burst open, and Whitmore came stumbling out, not surrendering, but firing wildly, the crack of gunfire shattering the cold morning air as Ashford's men scattered for cover. "Get down!" Ethan's voice roared across the clearing, and Clara watched in horror as he dove behind an overturned water trough. Ashford, right beside him, returned fire, cracking out from 3 different positions around the clearing. It was over in less than a minute, though it felt to Clara like it stretched across an hour. Whitmore's wild, panicked shots, finding nothing but air and splintering wood, until a return shot from one of Ashford's deputies caught him in the leg and dropped him hard into the dirt, his pistol skittering from his grip. The silence that followed was almost worse than the gunfire itself. "Ethan!" Clara was moving before she'd fully decided to, breaking from the tree line, despite Otis's shouted protest, running across the clearing toward the water trough where Ethan had taken cover. He rose as she reached him, unhurt, breathing hard, and the relief that crashed through her was so total she nearly collapsed against him. "I'm fine," he said, quickly catching her against his good shoulder. "Clara, I'm fine, it's over." Behind them, Ashford's men were hauling Whitmore upright, binding his wrists. Despite his wound, the man's face contorted with pain and a fury that had finally completely lost every trace of its former polish. "This isn't finished," Whitmore spat as they dragged him past his eyes, finding Ethan across the clearing, with a hatred so raw it seemed to physically radiate off him. "You think this valley will simply forget 6 years of respectability? Because of one desperate school teacher's meddling, I built half this territory with my own 2 hands. You built it on a family's graves," Ethan said quietly, and something in his voice, steady unshaken, finally at peace with a truth he'd carried alone for 6 long years, seemed to land harder than any shout could have. "That's the only thing this valley will remember now, Whitmore. Whatever else you built, it's finished, same as you are." Whitmore had no answer for that. Ashford's men led him toward the horses, and Clara watched him go with a strange, hollow feeling settling in her chest. Not triumph exactly, though there was relief woven through it. Something closer to the quiet, exhausted stillness that comes after a storm has finally passed, leaving behind only the work of counting what remained standing. The ride back to Silver Creek felt different from any journey Clara had taken since arriving in the territory, lighter somehow. Despite the exhaustion pulling at every limb, despite the cold morning air, and the long miles still ahead. Ethan rode beside her in careful, watchful silence for the first hour, his wounded shoulder clearly paining him more than he was willing to admit, until finally he spoke. 6 years, he said quietly, almost to himself. 6 years, I told myself I'd made peace with never knowing the truth. That I'd simply learned to live with the not knowing, the way a man learns to live with a scar that never quite stops aching in cold weather. He glanced over at her, something raw and unguarded in his expression. "I don't think I ever really believed that. I think I just told myself I did, because the alternative, actually chasing the truth, actually risking everything to find it, felt like more than I could survive losing a second time. And now I know." His voice cracked slightly on the words. "And it's strange, Clara. I thought knowing would feel like victory. Instead, it just feels like grief again, fresh, like losing them all over a second time, except this time, I understand exactly what was taken and why." Clara reached across the space between their horses, and he caught her hand holding tight. "Grief doesn't disappear just because the truth finally arrives," she said softly. "But maybe now it doesn't have to carry the weight of uncertainty on top of everything else. Maybe now you can grieve them as what they were, a family who loved you, who you loved back with everything in you, instead of grieving them as a mystery you were never able to solve." He was quiet for a long moment, the horses moving steadily along the trail, the morning sun beginning to burn away the last of the mountain chill. "I don't know how to be a man who isn't fighting something," he admitted finally, voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent 6 years bracing for the next blow, the next whisper, the next reminder that I don't belong in the world the way whole unscarred men belong in it. I don't know what's left of me once that fight is finally actually over. Maybe," Clara said gently. "You get to find out. For the first time in 6 years, Ethan, you actually get to find out." Silver Creek greeted their return with a reception Clara couldn't have imagined even a month earlier, the street filling as word spread of what had happened at the line shack. Faces that had once regarded Ethan with wary suspicion, now watching him with something closer to shame, to respect, to the slow, grudging beginning of welcome. Otis was the first to reach them, pulling Ethan into a rough, one-armed embrace that clearly pained his healing shoulder, though Ethan didn't complain once. "Knew it," Otis said gruffly, blinking hard against something suspiciously close to tears. "Knew all along there was more to that fire than this town wanted to believe. Knew your father raised you better than the Whispers ever gave you credit for." More followed Council President Harmon, awkward and stiff with apology. Perkins, the burly father, who'd confronted Clara outside the schoolhouse, now offering a rough, sincere handshake and a mumbled acknowledgement that he'd been wrong to doubt her. Even Samuel Hargrove, the small boy from her classroom, darting out from behind his mother's skirts to tug at Ethan's sleeve with wide, awestruck eyes. "You caught him," Samuel breathed. "The bad man. You really caught him." Ethan crouched down slowly, wincing at the pull in his shoulder, and met the boy's eyes with a gentleness that made Clara's throat tighten. "We caught him, Samuel. Took a whole town finally willing to see the truth, though. Don't forget that part." The boy nodded solemnly. Then, with the sudden unself-consciousness only children possess, threw his arms around Ethan's neck in a fierce hug before darting back to his mother, leaving Ethan kneeling in the street with an expression of such stunned, unguarded emotion that Clara had to look away for a moment, overwhelmed by the sight of it. The weeks that followed brought the slow, steady work of rebuilding. Not just the fences Whitmore's men had cut, not just the reputation 6 years of whispers had worn thin, but something deeper. Something Clara watched unfold in Ethan day by day, like the first green shoots pushing up through scorched earth after a long winter. The territorial marshal's office confirmed everything Reeves's statement had suggested, and more, uncovering records of similar schemes Whitmore had orchestrated against smaller landholders across 3 counties, families who'd lost their land under circumstances that had until now been quietly dismissed as unfortunate coincidence. Formal charges followed swiftly: conspiracy, arson, and pending further investigation into the deaths that night. Considerably more serious accusations still being assembled by a prosecutor eager to make an example of a man who'd terrorized the territory in expensive coats and respectable smiles for the better part of a decade. Ethan testified before the territorial court twice in those weeks, each time returning to the ranch, drained and hollow-eyed, carrying the fresh weight of reliving that night in front of strangers who examined his grief like evidence rather than the raw private thing it had always been to him. Clara was there each time he returned, steady and waiting, asking nothing of him beyond his willingness to let her sit beside him through the silence that inevitably followed. "I keep waiting to feel like it's finished," he admitted one evening, sitting on the porch steps with his bad arm finally free of its sling, testing the healed muscle with slow, careful movements. "Like there should be some moment where all of it simply stops weighing on me. But it doesn't work that way, does it?" "No." Clara agreed, settling beside him. "I don't think grief ever fully finishes. I think it just changes shape over time. Gets easier to carry, even if it never disappears completely." "You sound like you're speaking from experience." She was quiet a moment, weighing how much of her own story she was ready to share. "My father died believing I'd ruined our family's name," she said finally. "A scandal back in Boston, nothing so dramatic as a fire, but it cost us everything just the same. Our standing, our friends. My father's health in the end, though the doctors called it his heart, same as your mother's, I suppose. I came west because there was nothing left of my old life worth staying for, and because I needed to discover whether I could build something entirely my own, somewhere nobody already had an opinion of who I was supposed to be." "And did you find it?" Clara looked out over the darkening fields at the ranch that had slowly, over these strange, dangerous weeks, come to feel less like a stranger's property and more like something achingly close to home. "I think I'm still finding it," she said softly. "But I think I'm closer than I've been in a very long while." Ethan reached over and took her hand, his rough, scarred fingers lacing gently through hers, and for a long moment neither of them spoke at all, content simply to sit together in the quiet, watching the last light fade from a sky finally blessedly free of the storms that had followed them both for so long. It was Otis in the end who found the courage neither of them quite managed on their own, showing up at the ranch unannounced one Sunday afternoon with a bottle of something he claimed was for celebrating. Though the look he gave Ethan carried considerably more purpose than simple festivity. "Boy," he said, settling onto the porch steps uninvited. "How long you intend to sit here dancing around what's plain as day to every soul who's watched the two of you together these past weeks?" Ethan's ears reddened slightly. "Otis, I buried your father, Ethan. Watched your mother waste away from grief the winter after. Watched you become a man alone on this land with nobody but an old blacksmith checking in on you out of guilty conscience and stubborn love." Otis's weathered face had gone unexpectedly serious. "That woman rode into a storm and pulled you off a mountainside, stood up in front of a town that had already condemned her right alongside you, and never once flinched, even with a bullet flying and a corrupt man's whole fortune bearing down against the both of you. You aiming to let a thing like that simply walk away because you're too frightened to say what everybody else already sees plain. It's not that simple." "Course it's simple. You're just choosing to make it complicated because complicated feels safer than risking something that actually matters to you." Otis pushed himself back up, collecting his hat with the air of a man who'd said his piece and had no further patience for lingering. Man spends 6 years hiding from the world because he's afraid of being hurt again. That's understandable given everything. But a man who's finally been handed a second chance and still won't reach for it. He shook his head slowly. "That's just a different kind of hiding, boy. Thought you were done with hiding." He left without waiting for a response. His wagon creaking away down the road, leaving Ethan sitting alone on the porch, with Otis's words settling heavy and undeniable in the quiet evening air. Clara arrived the following afternoon to find him waiting for her at the fence line, dressed with more care than she'd ever seen him take, his scarred face turned fully toward her the moment she came into view. No angling away, no flinching from her gaze, just open and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch before he'd even said a word. "Ethan, is something wrong?" "No." He came forward to help her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Nothing's wrong. I just—" He exhaled slowly, some of his usual careful control visibly slipping. "I've been trying to find the right way to say something for weeks now, and I keep losing my nerve every time I come close." Clara's heart had begun to pound. "Say what?" He led her toward the small, overgrown garden near the house, the one she'd noticed on her very first visit, his mother's roses still growing wild and untended among the weeds, and stopped there facing her fully in the golden afternoon light. "My mother planted these," he said quietly, "before the fire. I never had the heart to tend them properly afterward, or to let them go entirely. Felt like the last piece of her still growing in this world, and I couldn't decide if caring for them was honoring her memory or just another way of refusing to let go of something I'd already lost. Ethan, I've spent 6 years believing I didn't deserve anything more than survival." He continued, his voice rough with an honesty that clearly cost him. "That the scars, the grief, the suspicion this whole town carried toward me, that it was somehow deserved, somehow earned, even though I knew deep down I'd done nothing but try to save my sister from a fire I never asked to survive." His hand found hers holding tight. "Then you rode out of a storm and refused to leave me on that mountainside, and every single day since you've refused to look away from me, the way this entire territory has for 6 years. You saw past the scars before you ever saw anything else about me. Clara and I don't know how to properly thank you for that, except to tell you the truth." "What truth?" "That I love you." The words left him raw and unpolished. Nothing like the smooth confessions in the novels Clara had read as a girl, and somehow all the more powerful for their rough, unguarded honesty. "That I have loved you, I think, since that first night on the ridge when you pressed a cloth against my wound and refused every single warning I gave you to leave. That I don't know how to imagine this ranch, this life, this future without you standing somewhere in the middle of it." Clara felt tears gathering hot and unexpected, and didn't bother fighting them. "Ethan Caldwell, are you asking me something or simply confessing?" A startled, breathless laugh escaped him, some of the tension breaking at last. "I suppose I'm asking, if you'll have me, scars and grief, and a ranch still recovering from 6 years of neglect, and everything else besides." "I already told you once," Clara said, closing the distance between them, her hand rising to touch the scarred side of his face, with a tenderness that made him close his eyes against the sensation. "It was never your scars I was drawn to, and it was never your scars I intend to spend my life beside. It was always you, Ethan. Every broken, stubborn, guarded piece of you." "Is that a yes?" "That," Clara said, rising up to press her lips gently to his, "is most certainly a yes." Word of the engagement moved through Silver Creek faster than any scandal ever had, and for the first time since Clara had arrived in the territory, she found herself grateful for exactly how quickly gossip traveled in a town this size. "Married," Mrs. Halloran said, arriving at the boarding house not an hour after Clara had confided the news to a single supposedly trustworthy neighbor. "To Ethan Caldwell." Well, the older woman's face had gone through several expressions in quick succession, surprise, something like worry, and finally unexpectedly a smile that softened her stern features entirely. I suppose I ought to have seen that coming, given how thoroughly that man managed to talk you into every kind of trouble these past 2 months. He didn't talk me into anything, Mrs. Halloran. I went willingly every step. That, Mrs. Halloran said, is precisely what worries me, and precisely why I believe you'll do well together. Stubbornness matched against stubbornness tends to hold steadier than most other foundations I've seen a marriage built on. She reached out, and in a gesture that startled Clara considerably, took her hand and squeezed it. I'm happy for you truly. This town owes you both a debt it can't ever fully repay. The wedding was set for 6 weeks out, time to allow the marshal's investigation into Whitmore's affairs to conclude, and the last of the legal proceedings to settle, before Ethan could, in his words, stand at an altar without half his mind still tangled up in courtroom testimony. Clara understood the caution, even as some impatient part of her wished the world would simply pause its complications long enough to let them have this one uncomplicated thing. The world, as it turned out, was not quite finished testing them yet. The letter arrived on a gray Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the wedding, delivered by a territorial marshal's rider who'd come the long way from the county seat with news that made Ethan's face drain of color the moment he finished reading it. What is it? Clara asked, watching him lower the paper with hands that had gone unsteady. Whitmore's lawyer has filed a motion. Ethan's voice was tight controlled, in the way she'd learned meant he was holding something back by sheer force of will. Claiming the evidence against him, Reeves's statement, the map, all of it was obtained through coercion and threat. Claiming I intimidated a frightened man into signing a false confession to settle a personal grudge. Clara felt the ground tilt beneath her. That's absurd. Reeves fled his own home in fear years before Ethan ever found him. Absurd or not, a judge has to hear the motion before the criminal trial can proceed. Ethan's jaw had set into a hard line. If it succeeds, everything we gathered gets thrown out. Whitmore walks on. The fire charges entirely. Keeps only the assault conviction from the shooting, and serves, 2 years, perhaps 3, for putting a bullet through my shoulder in front of half this town. His hands had curled into fists. 2 years for what he did to my family. That's what his lawyer is asking a judge to consider a fair accounting. He won't succeed. Clara said it with more certainty than she entirely felt, reaching for his hand. Reeves testified before a notary of his own free will 300 miles from you, with no threat hanging over him beyond his own conscience. That will hold Ethan. It has to hold. And if it doesn't... She didn't have an answer for that, and the not knowing sat heavy between them for the rest of that long gray day. The hearing was scheduled in the county seat, 2 days' hard ride from Silver Creek, and Clara insisted on accompanying him, despite his half-hearted attempts to convince her to stay behind and mind the schoolhouse. I'm not sitting in a classroom teaching multiplication while a judge decides whether the truth about your family gets buried a second time, she told him, already packing a small trunk, with a determination that left no room for argument. You didn't let me stay behind for the line shack. You certainly aren't leaving me behind for this. He didn't argue further. She suspected, watching the relief he tried and failed to hide, that he hadn't truly wanted to. The courthouse in the county seat was larger and colder than anything Silver Creek possessed, all hard wooden benches and echoing ceilings, and Clara sat rigid beside Otis, who had insisted on making the journey as well, unwilling to let Ethan face this alone, while Whitmore's lawyer, a sharp-featured man with an expensive coat that reminded her uncomfortably of his client's old wardrobe, laid out his case. The document in question, the lawyer said, pacing before the judge's bench with practiced confidence, was obtained by a man with a well-documented personal vendetta against my client, traveling under circumstances that cannot be independently verified from a witness who has since proven impossible to locate for cross-examination. Clara's stomach dropped. Impossible to locate. Beside her, Ethan had gone rigid, his knuckles white where his hands gripped his knees. "They found him," he whispered, horror creeping into his voice. "Or they made certain nobody else could." The judge, an older man with tired eyes and a manner that gave away nothing, turned toward the prosecution's table. "Is the witness present to testify, or is the sworn statement all this court has been provided?" The territorial prosecutor, a younger man named Whitfield, no relation to Clara, though the coincidence had startled her when she'd first learned his name, rose slowly, and something in his hesitation made Clara's heart sink even before he spoke. "Your Honor, we regret to inform the court that Mr. Reeves cannot be located at this time. His last known residence outside Bozeman was found abandoned 3 days ago. Neighbors report he departed suddenly without explanation, leaving most of his belongings behind." A murmur swept the small courtroom, and Clara felt Ethan's hand find hers beneath the bench, gripping so tight it nearly hurt. "They got to him," he breathed. "Whitmore's people got to him before the trial, same as they got to him before the fire investigation ever properly started." "We don't know that," Clara whispered back, though her own voice had gone thin with fear. "Given these circumstances," the judge said, his expression unreadable, "I am inclined to consider the defense's motion seriously. A sworn statement from a witness who cannot be produced for cross-examination carries considerably less weight than one who can. I'll require additional corroborating evidence before I permit this document to stand as the foundation of a capital case." Whitmore's lawyer's expression bloomed into something close to triumph, and across the courtroom, seated near the front with a heavy bandage still visible beneath his collar, where the bullet wound in his leg continued, healing Charles Whitmore allowed himself, for the first time since his arrest, the faintest ghost of a smile. Clara felt fury rise in her chest, hot and desperate. This could not be how it ended, not after everything, not after the ridge and the fences and the courtroom testimony that had already cost Ethan so much of himself to give. "Your Honor." She was on her feet before she'd fully decided to speak, her voice carrying clear and steady across the hushed courtroom despite every eye suddenly turning toward her. "If I may address the court." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. "And you are?" "Clara Whitfield, schoolteacher of Silver Creek." She kept her chin level, refusing to be intimidated by the weight of so many unfamiliar eyes. "I was present when Mr. Reeves's statement was notarized. I corresponded with the land office in Helena myself regarding the original survey filing, and I can attest that the document in question predates any personal grievance between Mr. Caldwell and Mr. Whitmore by a full 2 years, filed notarized, and a matter of public record long before Mr. Caldwell ever had cause to seek out a witness at all." "Objection," Whitmore's lawyer snapped. "This woman is engaged to marry the accuser. Her testimony can hardly be considered impartial. Nor can Mr. Whitmore's claim of coercion be considered impartial, given he stands to lose everything should this evidence hold." The prosecutor shot back some fire, finally entering his previously cautious demeanor. "Your Honor, I would remind the court that the original land office filing exists independently of Mr. Reeves's statement entirely. Miss Whitfield's correspondence with Helena predates any question of the witness's availability. I request the court examine those original records directly, rather than dismissing this case on a technicality that conveniently arose only days before this hearing." The judge studied the room for a long, silent moment, Clara standing rigid beside Ethan Whitmore's composed, waiting expression, the prosecutor's barely restrained urgency. "I'll grant a continuance," he said finally. 2 weeks. Sufficient time for this court to obtain certified copies of the original land office filing directly from Helena, independent of any witness testimony that may or may not be available going forward. If those records corroborate the timeline as described, this case proceeds to full trial. If they do not, I'll revisit the defense's motion at that time. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't the collapse Clara had feared moments earlier either, and she sank back onto the bench beside Ethan with her legs trembling from the adrenaline of having spoken it all. "You didn't have to do that," Ethan murmured, his voice rough with something between gratitude and fear for what she'd just risked. "Yes," Clara said quietly, watching Whitmore's composed expression finally crack just slightly at the delay he clearly hadn't anticipated. I did.
Checktonique.
The 2 weeks that followed stretched taut, with an anxiety that settled into every corner of their days, even as wedding preparations continued around them, with a strange, dissonant normalcy. Mrs. Halloran fussing over fabric for a dress. Otis insisting on building a proper table for the ranch house with his own 2 hands. The whole of Silver Creek slowly, steadily rallying around the couple, whose story had become in some strange way the town's own redemption as much as theirs. Word arrived on the 11th day, carried by the same weary marshal's rider, and this time it was Clara who tore the letter open with shaking hands, while Ethan paced the length of the porch, unable to sit still under the weight of waiting. Helena confirms it. She read aloud, relief crashing through her voice before she'd even finished the sentence. Certified copies of the original 1878 survey filing cross-referenced against county property records. The timeline holds exactly as Reeves's statement described. The judge has denied the defense's motion. The case proceeds to full trial set for, her voice caught, set for 3 weeks from now. Ethan stood frozen at the porch railing for a long moment, and then, without warning, something in him seemed to finally fully release 6 years of carried grief and suspicion and fear, breaking loose all at once, and he crossed the porch in 2 strides and pulled Clara into an embrace so fierce it lifted her clean off her feet. "It's real," he said, voice cracking against her hair. "Clara, it's actually real. They can't bury it this time." "No," she said, laughing and crying at once, clinging to him just as tightly. "They can't." The trial, when it finally came, lasted 4 exhausting days' testimony from the territorial marshal's investigators detailing the pattern of similar schemes across 3 counties. Testimony from Otis regarding the map and its discovery. The certified survey records laid out in careful, damning detail before a jury of 12 men who listened with expressions growing steadily grimmer as the full shape of Whitmore's decade-long campaign became clear. Ethan testified last on the 4th day, and Clara watched from the gallery as he stood before the courtroom and for the first time in 6 years told the full story of that night without flinching. The fire, his father's rifle, Mary Ellen's window, the beam that had come down across his face and shoulder, even as he pulled his sister free. "I've spent 6 years believing I imagined a connection nobody else could see," he said, his voice steady, despite the visible effort it cost him. 6 years, letting an entire town's doubt convince me I might be wrong about my own family's murder. I wasn't wrong. I was only waiting for someone willing to help me prove it. When the jury retired to deliberate, Clara sat beside Otis in the hallway outside the courtroom, her hands twisted together in her lap, watching Ethan pace the same worn floorboards he'd paced through every recess of the 4-day trial. "Whatever happens," Otis said quietly, watching him with the weathered patience of a man who'd known Ethan since boyhood. "That boy's already won something no verdict can take from him. Whole territory knows the truth now. Knows what kind of man he really is, instead of what his scars made folks assume." "It won't feel like enough if Whitmore walks free," Clara said. "No," Otis agreed. "But it'll be true regardless. And truth's got a way of outlasting whatever a jury decides given enough time." The jury returned after 3 hours, and Clara's heart hammered so violently she thought it might be audible across the crowded courtroom as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict. On the charge of arson resulting in death, guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit fraud, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder regarding the incident at the Silver Creek town meeting, guilty. The courtroom erupted into sound, and Clara found herself on her feet without remembering, standing, tears streaming freely down her face as Ethan turned from the front of the room to find her in the crowd. His own expression, a raw, overwhelmed mixture of grief and relief, and something that looked for the first time since she'd met him like genuine peace. Whitmore was sentenced 2 days later to life imprisonment in the Territorial Penitentiary, his fortune seized and distributed in part toward restitution for the families whose land he'd stolen across 3 counties over the better part of a decade. He said nothing as the sentence was read, his composed mask never fully returning, and Clara felt no triumph watching him led away in chains, only a deep, quiet exhaustion, and beneath it, finally, something like closure. They were married 3 weeks later on a clear autumn morning that Silver Creek would talk about for years afterward, not for its scandal this time, but for the sheer size of the crowd that turned out to witness it. The small church could not hold everyone who came. People stood along the walls, spilled out through the open doors into the churchyard. Children perched on their fathers' shoulders for a better view. And Clara standing at the back, in a dress Mrs. Halloran had spent 3 weeks fussing over. Despite endless protests, that simplicity would suit her. Fine felt her breath catch at the sight of so many faces. Faces that had once looked at her with suspicion, now watching with open warmth, gathered to witness something that had once seemed impossible. Otis walked her down the aisle since her own father had been gone 3 years, and there was, in truth, no one else she would have wanted for the honor. His weathered face was uncharacteristically soft with emotion the entire walk, and when he placed her hand in Ethan's at the altar, his voice was rough with something he didn't bother hiding. "You take good care of her, boy. She's earned better than a lifetime of trouble, same as you have. I intend to spend the rest of my life making certain of it," Ethan said, and the promise in his voice carried clear enough that half the church seemed to hear it. A murmur of approval rippling through the crowded pews. Clara looked up at him, at the scarred face turned fully toward her without hesitation. Now without the old instinct to hide or angle away unguarded in front of the entire town that had once made him believe he deserved nothing but their suspicion, and felt something settle deep in her chest, warm and certain, and entirely her own. "I, Ethan Caldwell, take you, Clara Whitfield." He said, his voice steady despite the visible emotion threatening to break through it, "to be my wife. To love you not despite everything we've survived, but because of the woman that survival revealed you to be. I promise you a life built on truth, Clara, whatever else it costs us." Clara's own vows came through tears. She made no effort to hide her voice, carrying clear across the silent, packed church. "I, Clara Whitfield, take you, Ethan Caldwell, to be my husband. I promise to keep seeing the man beneath whatever scars this world leaves on you, the way I saw him from the very first night on that mountain in a storm. Neither of us expected would change everything. I promise you a home, Ethan. Somewhere you never have to hide again." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the church erupted into applause so loud it startled the birds from the trees outside, and Ethan kissed her right there at the altar, with a tenderness that made half the older women in the pews reach for their handkerchiefs. And Clara felt for the first time in longer than she could remember that she had finally truly arrived somewhere that could rightfully be called home. The years that followed unfolded with a quiet, steady richness that neither of them had quite dared to imagine during those dangerous, uncertain weeks of fighting for the truth. Clara continued teaching at the Silver Creek schoolhouse, her position never again questioned by a council that had learned through hard and public experience exactly the cost of doubting her judgment. She expanded the school within 2 years, petitioning the territorial government for funds to build a second room to accommodate the growing number of families settling in the valley, now that Whitmore's shadow no longer hung over every transaction and every parcel of land. Ethan rebuilt slowly, and with his own 2 hands, the section of the ranch that had stood scorched and empty for 6 long years, not erasing the memory of what had stood there before, but building something new alongside it. A small addition to the house that became in time a nursery for children of their own. He kept his mother's roses, tending them now, instead of merely enduring their persistence, and added new plantings alongside them each spring, until the garden became something neither entirely old nor entirely new, but a living testament to everything the land had survived and everything it had grown to become since. Otis remained a fixture at the ranch, his forge eventually passing to a young apprentice, while he spent his later years exactly where he'd always felt most at home, on the Caldwell porch, telling stories to whichever grandchildren happened to be visiting his weathered face, soft with a contentment Clara suspected he'd waited a very long time to feel. Mary Ellen came home for the wedding and stayed longer than she'd intended, and slowly over the years that followed, began returning to Silver Creek more often than not, drawn back, she admitted once to Clara, by the sight of her brother finally truly at peace in the home that had once held so much grief for them both. "I used to think I couldn't come back because everything here reminded me of what we lost." she said, watching Ethan across the yard, laughing at something one of his children had said, his scarred face open and unguarded in the afternoon sun. Now I come back because everything here reminds me of what he found instead. Sheriff Ashford retired from his post some years later, and at his farewell gathering, held in the very town hall where Whitmore's schemes had finally unraveled before the whole community, he pulled Ethan aside with an expression Clara had rarely seen on the old lawman's weathered face, something close to genuine regret. "I owe you more than an apology I can properly give in words, Caldwell," he said, his voice rough. 6 years I watched this town whisper about you, and I let it happen because it was easier than asking hard questions about a man with money and influence. I think about that more than I'd like to admit, especially now that I've got the time to sit with my own conscience. "You believed me in the end," Ethan said. "That's more than most managed. Believing you, in the end, doesn't undo the years you spent carrying that suspicion alone." Ashford shook his head slowly. "I hope you know, truly know, that the man this town sees, now the one your children will grow up knowing, was always the man underneath everything. We just took too long to look properly." Ethan glanced across the room to where Clara stood laughing at something Mrs. Halloran had said their eldest daughter perched on her hip, and something warm and unguarded settled across his scarred features. "Somebody looked properly," he said quietly. "Eventually that turned out to be enough." Yuck. There came an evening years into their marriage, when Clara found Ethan sitting alone by the ashes of the old foundation, the same scorched ground she'd first seen. On her very first visit to the ranch, still visible even now, beneath the grass that had long since reclaimed most of it. A permanent quiet marker of everything that had once stood there and everything that had been lost. She settled beside him without a word, and for a long while they simply sat together in the deepening dusk, listening to the sound of their children's laughter drifting from the house behind them, where Mary Ellen's visit had turned into an impromptu evening of stories and games that showed no sign of winding down. "I used to come out here and feel like I was visiting a grave," Ethan said finally, his voice quiet and reflective in a way that had become familiar to her over the years, a peace he'd earned rather than simply inherited. "Now, I come out here and feel like I'm visiting the beginning of something. Strange how the same ground can hold both those feelings at once. Grief and gratitude," Clara said softly. "I don't think they ever fully stop living side by side once you've survived something like what you survived. I think that's simply what it means to carry a full life instead of an empty one." He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers with the same easy, familiar tenderness that had become second nature between them over the years, and looked out at the land that had once nearly cost him everything, and had instead, against every fear that had once kept him locked away from the world, given him back a life richer than anything he'd once believed himself entitled to hope for. "My father used to say a man's measured by what he protects, not by what he's lost," Ethan said. "Took me a long time to understand what he meant by that. I think I finally do now." "What do you protect now?" He looked toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from its windows, toward the sound of their children's voices carrying across the quiet evening air, toward Clara herself, sitting beside him on ground that had once held nothing but ash and grief, and now held instead an entire life built stubbornly and deliberately out of truth. "Everything that matters," he said simply. "Every single thing that matters." The scars on his face had never faded. Not truly. Some things Clara had come to understand were never meant to disappear entirely, only to become part of the larger story a person carried forward. But she had watched over the slow, steady accumulation of these years together. The way those scars had stopped being the first thing anyone in Silver Creek noticed about him and become instead simply one small, honest chapter in a much longer story. A story of a boy who had run into fire to save his sister. A man who had endured 6 years of unjust suspicion, rather than surrender the truth, and a husband and father who had finally fully let himself be loved exactly as he was, without hiding, without apology, without ever again believing that the marks life left on a person made them any less worthy of a home. Clara Caldwell rested her head against her husband's shoulder as the last light faded from the Montana sky, and understood with a certainty, as solid as the land beneath them, that some stories did not end with everything returned to what it once was. Some stories ended instead with something better built entirely from the wreckage. A truth finally spoken, a family finally whole, and a love that had never once needed a man to be unbroken in order to be worth choosing completely and forever, exactly as he was.